The origin of the war. Morning of July 161,990. U.S. Department of Defense intelligence personnel are interpreting images of the Middle East sent back by Keyhole. They found that an Iraqi tank division's vanguard appeared in a desert in southeastern Iraq that was originally uninhabited, north of Kuwait. The tanks used by this unit were E-70 heavy tanks provided by the Soviet Union. Only Iraq's most elite Republican Guard has such equipment. War images show that this unit is the most elite Hammurabi division of the Iraqi Republican Guard. It was used as a sharp knife in the Iran-Iraq War which just ended. The target of this elite Iraqi force is very clear. It is its neighboring country, Kuwait. Kuwait is both a small political country and a big oil country. This country, with less than 20,000 square kilometers, is almost floating on the sea of oil. Iraq has always strongly accused Kuwait of excessive exploitation, which has led to a drop in oil prices, causing Iraq to suffer huge losses in oil exports. Previously, the United States believed that Iraq's complaints were not enough to make Iraq use force against Kuwait, but the situation learned through reconnaissance satellites is like this. On July 17, the Iraqi Hammurabi Division was deployed on the Kuwait border. On July 18, the Light Division and the Belief in Allah Division also appeared near the Kuwait border deployment in Medina. The Americans were confused when they saw this situation. What on earth did Iraq suddenly deploy its three most important divisions on the border? July 24, the U.S. Secretary of Defense suddenly announced that the U.S. Navy would conduct joint military exercises with the UAE in the Gulf region. This was a move made by the U.S. before it could figure out what Iraq was trying to do. The UAE is also a country that has made a fortune from oil. Like Kuwait, it was also threatened by Iraq due to overexploitation and lower oil prices. It was a coincidence. Some time ago, the UAE asked the US to buy advanced aircraft and conduct joint exercises because it was worried about the threat from Iraq. At this time, the US took this opportunity to drive an aircraft carrier into the Gulf. Navy aviation aircraft take off and land on the deck of the aircraft carrier. This is a typical performance of the United States showing off its military power. At this time, the United States made various judgments on Iraq's intentions. Iraq will not really attack Kuwait. Kuwait's defense force is too weak. Even if it wants to use force against Kuwait, it does not need three elite divisions. What the United States is really worried about is the Soviet Union behind Iraq. The Soviet Union has always sought to be on par with the United States in military terms. Throughout the 1970s and the early to mid-1980s, the Soviet Union's strategic intention was to go south to the Indian Ocean to control the oil-producing countries in the Middle East. The countries that separated the Soviet Union from the Indian Ocean were Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and Iraq. So the Soviet Union tried to intervene in these countries. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 is an example. The Soviet Union adopted a more gentle approach towards Iran and Iraq. The Soviet Union had a special liking for Iraq. This country claims to be anti-imperialist and anti-colonial, and announced the nationalization of oil and other measures. It is quite in line with the Soviet values. The Soviet Union provided a lot of assistance to Iraq, including a large number of weapons. Obviously, this is not a good sign for the West, because Iraq is located at the southern end of the Persian Gulf, overlooking the Gulf region, which is the most densely populated oil route in the world and is vital to the West. Although since Gorbachev came to power, the Soviet Union has greatly reduced its edge in international affairs, and its relationship with Iraq is not as close as before. But no one can guarantee that Iraq's actions have nothing to do with the Soviet Union. Iraq was ruled by the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. During World War I, Iraq became a battlefield for the British Army. The British drove away the Turks and occupied the entire territory of Iraq. Then it became a British mandate. In 1921, Iraq declared independence and established the Kingdom of Iraq. But the independence at this time was fake. Britain continued its colonial rule in Iraq with unequal treaties. Oil was discovered in Iraq in 1927. 5 years later, the British flag fell from Iraqi soil. This means that Britain will give Iraq complete independence. In return, Britain obtained most of the oil benefits from Iraq. A military coup took place in Baghdad on July 141,958. The Free Officers' Organization of the coup quickly occupied the Royal Palace, the Prime Minister's residence, the Ministry of Defense Telegraph Bureau, the police station, the radio station, and other key departments. The king and the crown prince were shot dead while escaping. With the support of the whole country, the Iraqi army destroyed the feudal monarchy and established a republic. The leader of the coup was Brigadier General Qasim, commander of the 19th Infantry Brigade of the Iraqi army. But the transition from monarchy to republic is not so simple. Qasim continued his dictatorial rule as the first prime minister of the Republic of Iraq. The Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party once sent a team to assassinate Qasim but failed. One of the members of the assassination team was Saddam. Saddam was injured after the failure. It would have been difficult to escape, but he miraculously escaped abroad. From then on, he became a legend in the Arab world. 20 years have passed in a flash. Saddam became the president of the Republic of Iraq on July 161,979, reaching the pinnacle of national power. This is Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers in the Middle East flow from west to east through the entire territory of Iraq. The world's earliest civilization originated in the Mesopotamian basin. It is one of the oldest cities in the Arab world. Many stories in the famous 1001 Nights reflect the splendor of Baghdad during this period, although the former glory is gone. But the leading figures in Iraq intend to reproduce a new 1001 Nights. The current president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, was born in 1937 in a poor peasant family in northern Baghdad. He became a member of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party at the age of 20. He began his rebellious career. The party's program is to unify the Arab world. The day Saddam took power in Iraq, he said something without any ambiguity. He wants to unify the Middle East in 50 years. He advocates the use of force and likes to wear military uniforms. Saddam also designed a triumphal arch himself. The shape of the triumphal arch is two hands holding an Arabian scimitar. One of them is from Nebuchadnezzar the Great, the monarch of the ancient Babylonian dynasty. The other hand is Saddam's own. The tragedy of many countries is that their strength does not match their ambitions. It is very difficult to strengthen one's own strength. This requires the entire country to invest long-term and hard work. How much effort it takes. It is so easy to start a war. However, countries that are unwilling to realize their ideals through their own efforts are usually arrogant. They do not have a correct estimate of their own capabilities. In the second year of Saddam's rule, he led the Iraqis into war, and the war lasted for 8 years. Iran and Iraq are both Muslim countries. But border disputes, sectarian disputes, and ethnic conflicts have turned the two countries against each other. September 221,980. At Saddam's order, Iraq's MiGs launched a surprise attack on Iran's important airports. Then Iraqi troops marched into Iran in 3 directions. At the beginning of the war, Iraq occupied 20,000 square kilometers of Iranian territory. It seemed that victory was in sight, but Saddam underestimated his opponent. A year later, the Iranian army launched a counterattack. The Iraqi army gradually lost the initiative on the battlefield. On July 141,982, Iran launched a counterattack. Iran has deployed 120,000 troops in this offensive. This is the largest land battle in the modern history of the Persian Gulf. The two sides fought back and forth, and the war lasted for a long time. The Iran-Iraq War was a war with the least sensitive target in the most sensitive region of the world. The deep-seated nature of this war is the sectarian dispute between Shia and Sunni in Islam. This war has nothing to do with the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So the United States and the Soviet Union did not intervene much. So Iran and Iraq are like two children whose parents are not at home. They cannot get strong restraint in doing anything. So both sides have taken all possible measures, including attacking each other's cruise ships and oil pipelines. Moreover, Iraq also found chemical weapons from the weapons of World War I and used them without scruples. In the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam as commander-in-chief of the Iraqi armed forces, like a big spider sitting in the center, skillfully weaving a web connecting the Arabs. War is a very expensive thing. Both Iran and Iraq have to use money to maintain the war. Iranians are Persians. Iraqis are Arabs. And the money is in the pockets of Arabs. There are 3 rich men in the Arab oil-producing countries. They are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. Saddam appeared at the front line in a dusty state, and repeatedly preached that this war was to prevent Khomeini's religious revolution from being imported into the Arab world. Although this was not entirely the case. But he still successfully lobbied the Arab oil tycoons. With donations from the Arab world, Saddam was able to form a Republican Guard. He had a total of 8 divisions, 120,000 troops, including 2 tank divisions, 5 armored divisions and 1 supply division. considered to be the most powerful army in the Arab world. There is no real winner in this war. Both sides are losers. The two former rich Gulf countries fought to exhaustion but gained nothing, because it was Tehran that first proposed a ceasefire. So Baghdad became the winner in face. But this winner in face has a hard time. Before the war, Iraq has $30 billion in foreign exchange reserves. At the end of the war, its debt was as high as more than $70 billion, and domestic inflation has soared. Oil production has dropped sharply. The number of unemployed people has increased sharply. The once prosperous Baghdad is now in ruins. Saddam's wallet is empty. All that is left is an army trained in the 8-year war. But the army needs money the most. The personnel and equipment need to be constantly updated. But Saddam can't even afford to maintain this army. The only place he could find money was Kuwait. Saddam met with Emir of Kuwait at the Iraq-Kuwait border. Saddam said that the Iraqi army had fought for 8 years. It was actually a shield to protect the Arab brothers from the Persian threat. Therefore, he expected the rich in the Arab world to help Iraq pay off its debts, or at least forgive the money Iraq owed them. But Kuwait knew very well he never needed Iraq to be a shield for him, so he rejected Iraq's request. Things have come to this point. Saddam claimed that Kuwait was part of Iraq. During the Ottoman Empire, Kuwait was once a county in the Basra province of Iraq, Ottoman Empire, until after the First World War. Britain and the Ottoman Empire signed the Treaty of Loss, and to establish the Kingdom of Iraq and the Emirate of Kuwait respectively. Iraq did not inherit the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, so it had no right to take Kuwait back under its name. Besides, this small country in the endless yellows and could not arouse the appetite of the Iraqis. But in 1938, Kuwait discovered the Bolan oil field. After the end of World War II, Kuwait's soil production area continued to expand. Two major oil fields connected to the Bolan oil field were discovered in Wam-Agandal Hadada areas, under the endless yellows, and was an oil sea. From this time on, the Iraqis began to have their eyes on Kuwait. They began to spread the word that they were ready to reclaim part of Kuwait's territory. But the Iraqis were just talking at this time. Iraq itself was under British control. Even its oil was controlled by the British. What can he do to Kuwait? As Kuwait's proven oil reserves continued to increase, Kuwait became an important target for Western capital. In October 1953, a British asked for sled by a small aircraft carrier entered the Persian Gulf in the name of maintaining order. Then the British Army landed in Kuwait, declaring that Britain would beat anyone who dared to touch Kuwait. Since Kuwait officially became a British protectorate in 1939, until 1961 Britain was forced to recognize Kuwait's independence. Kuwait has always survived under the protection of Western powers. Since 1957, the Kuwaiti government has gradually nationalized its oil resources through various means such as equity participation. Until 1980, all oil was nationalized. And in that year, Iraq entered the war against Iran. The Iraqis fought in the dark 8 years. It was the 8 years when Kuwait's economy achieved rapid development. This country in the desert was transformed into a garden. The capital, Kuwait City, has become an international metropolis. Since Jabalbai served as Kuwait since the emir, he has transferred a large amount of petrodollars to the United States and Europe for investment. He has established a large-scale investment network around the world. Investment income even exceeds oil income. Its per capita national income once ranked first in the world. For the Iraqis who are suffering in the war, the wealthy neighbor is a great temptation. Saddam even said at that time, Kuwait is just a branch of Iraq. It means that Iraq has the right to annex this wealthy small country. Kuwait also took precautions against Iraq's ambitions, in order to prevent Iraq from finding an excuse. During the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait always carefully served the powerful Iraq. The Kuwaiti government provided Iraq with $15 billion for him to purchase arms. Also allowed Iraq to use the military base on Kuwaiti territory. Also agreed to lend Biting Island for the Iraqi Navy. Kuwait only expected Iraq not to bother him in return. But the Kuwaitis did not expect that their generosity would make Saddam's desire burn even more. The population structure of Kuwait in the late 1980s ended to be internationalized. Of the total population of more than 2.1 million, only 1.3 are Kuwaitis. The remaining 2.3 are expatriates from more than 120 countries and regions around the world. It seems that the whole world is working for this rich oil country. In contrast, Iraqis live in the long shadow of the 8-year war. In the face of this strong contrast, Iraq began to find excuses to rob Kuwait. Iraq is also an oil powerhouse. and its proven reserves are slightly more than Kuwait. The oil layer structures of desert oil fields are similar. It's just that Kuwait is located in the thickest oil layer. There is a section of the Iraq-Kuwait border that has not yet been demonstrated. So Iraq claimed. During the Iran-Iraq War, a large part of Kuwait's financial aid to Iraq was obtained by stealing Iraq's crude oil. No matter from which angle look, Iraq's accusation seems ungrateful. This ungrateful speech is matched by treacherous war preparations. From July 161,990, 3 elite tank divisions of the Iraqi Republican Guard began to gather toward the Iraqi border. The United States learned through satellite images. The Hamrabi Division and the Trust and Allah Division gradually entered their positions, near a road leading directly to central Kuwait. Hundreds of tanks stretched for miles. The Medina Light Division moved to the west of Kuwait. All 3 divisions were deployed within 10 to 30 miles of the Kuwaiti border. The tanks were arranged in a traditional close formation with their guns facing outwards. Iraq's murderous intentions were exposed. But the United States still believed until then. If Iraq really wanted to fight, it would be enough to use a police force to deal with the small Kuwait. He deployed 3 divisions, which showed that he was not prepared to fight and was just bluffing. The United States' judgment was based on the fact that the negotiations between Iraq and Kuwait had not broken down. At this time, Iraq was demanding through diplomatic channels that Kuwait pay $4 billion in compensation for stealing oil. And Saddam told the people in Baghdad that Kuwait's failure to comply with OPEC's production quota had caused a sharp drop in oil prices in the world oil market. Iraq had suffered a loss of $14 billion since the second half of 1989 alone. He said this was a conspiracy planned by the United States and carried out by the Gulf rulers, using a dagger coated with poison to stab Iraq from behind. Saddam told the Iraqis, "Whoever cuts off Iraq's means of survival, Iraq will cut off his neck." No one intends to cut off Iraq's means of survival, but Saddam intends to break Kuwait's neck. After the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq had the most powerful army among Arab countries. Its army has 1 million people. The Air Force has more than 40,000 people. It has 1048 aircraft of various types. Iraq only has a 50-kilometer coastline near the port of Basra, but has nearly 50 combat ships. This huge military machine can crush Kuwait with a slight turn. Seeing that the Arab brothers were about to fight, Egyptian President Mubarak flew to Baghdad on July 24. Saddam gave him a reassuring pill. He said he would not use force before the negotiations broke down. Saddam also asked Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Front, who came to mediate, to send a message to the Emir of Kuwait. He said he would withdraw his troops if Kuwait gave him $10 billion. The reason why I want $10 billion is because the Kuwaitis stole our oil. When he said this, Iraq had already assembled 100,000 troops on the Iraq-Kuwait border. On July 256 days before the war, Saddam suddenly summoned Gillespie, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq. Saddam talked a lot with the 48-year-old female ambassador, but only one sentence left an impression on Gillespie. That is, Iraq promised not to use force against Kuwait. When the domestic economy is in a mess, direct the attention of the people abroad. Blaming the cause of mass poverty on foreign countries is a common political tactic used by many rulers. Under Saddam's instigation, the Iraqis really thought that their hard life was caused by the Kuwaitis stealing oil. On July 27, Baghdad citizens took to the streets to demand that Saddam punish Kuwait for stealing oil. The U.S. response. The U.S. sent photos of the Iraqi army gathering on the Kuwaiti border taken by reconnaissance satellites to the leaders of Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. But these Arab leaders all believed that the Iraqi troops approaching the border were pure blackmail. The purpose was nothing more than to take money out of Kuwait's pockets. Until this time, the countries in the Gulf region that were paying attention to the world and the Iraqis who were shouting angrily on the streets had never thought that war was just around the corner. July 28, Saddam calmly awarded medals to his beloved Republican Guard soldiers, inspiring the morale of the troops. It should be said that the invasion is imminent. On July 29, Republican Guard soldiers gathered on the Iraq-Kuwait border, entering the attack positions one after another. The U.S. Keyhole satellite monitored all this. But until this time, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Powell still believed that the Iraqi army did not seem to launch an attack because of the lack of necessary conditions. First, judging from the intercepted communications, the Iraqi army has very little communication volume. It can be seen that the communication system has not been established well. Second, the artillery was not in place. Third, there was no ammunition supply. Fourth, the tank troops lacked logistics. Powell's analysis was impeccable. But at 6 noon August 1, when the Pentagon's intelligence analysts saw the new satellite images, they were shocked. Overnight, the Iraqi army not only mobilized all the tanks in place, and the communication system has been established. Artillery has also entered the position. Ammunition is being transported to the front line. It should be said that this is an extremely beautiful military operation. In 11 days, 8 fully combat divisions were secretly mobilized from an area 400 miles away and quickly deployed in place within a day. The Pentagon of the United States urgently drafted a top-secret warning document. Iraq will launch an attack on Kuwait that night or the next day. In the early morning of August 21,990, 100,000 Iraqi troops divided into 2 routes to attack Kuwait. This is undoubtedly the world's top news. This video was shot by a Western resident in his apartment with a home video camera. He is the only one who recorded the Iraqi tanks rushing into Kuwait City. A few days later, when the person who shot this scene smuggled out of Kuwait with this videotape, the whole world witnessed the real situation in the Persian Gulf. President Bush was on vacation when the Iraqi tanks launched the attack. After he heard the news that Saddam was attacking Kuwait, the first thing that came to his mind was that Iraq and Kuwait together accounted for 20 of the world's known oil reserves. After Saddam occupied Kuwait, he would control 1/5 of the world's oil reserves. He would be able to manipulate the world's oil prices. President Bush rushed back to Washington, the capital, and convened an emergency meeting at the White House overnight. At the beginning of the meeting, the issue of military strikes was discussed. It was not until then that all the participants realized there was not a single American soldier in the Middle East. The closest U.S. military base to the Persian Gulf is Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean, 3,000 miles away. Despite this, at 8 a.m., President Bush made his first public statement on the Gulf crisis and imposed an economic blockade on Iraq. On the same day at the United Nations headquarters in Manhattan, New York, delegations of various countries voted to pass Resolution 660, calling on Iraq to withdraw its troops from Kuwait immediately and unconditionally. Of course, Saddam will not heed this call. The Iraqi army has occupied all of Kuwait. Saddam jubilantly told his subordinates that he had pried open a big money box. This is Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz. When he defended himself at the United Nations, Saddam is awarding medals to meritorious personnel. Emir and Crown Prince fled when Iraqi troops captured Kuwait's capital. Prince Fahd, brother of Emir Jaber, died in the battle to defend the Dasman Palace. At this time, Kuwait has established a Free Kuwait interim government. This interim government claims that Iraq will merge Iraq and Kuwait at the request of this government. At this time, the European community announced a trade embargo on Iraq. To prevent Iraq from using Kuwait's investments in Europe and the United States and the European community froze Iraqi and Kuwaiti assets in their own countries. The total value of these assets is estimated at more than $50 billion. These measures did not make Saddam back down. He ordered an emergency conscription to form 11 more divisions based on the existing forces. A strong nationalist sentiment permeated Iraq. It seemed that they were ready to fight the whole world to the death. The United Nations immediately took countermeasures. On August 6, the Security Council held a meeting to demand a worldwide trade embargo on Iraq. The Gulf crisis first disrupted the world oil market. In addition to the world trade embargo, all major trading venues in the world were in chaos. Iraq has controlled a considerable amount of world oil production due to fear of energy shortages. In the spot market, the price of oil products soared, and the stocks of other companies related to the Arab world plummeted. At this time, the only hope for Saddam to change his mind was the small circle of decision-makers in the Arab world. The common Arab nation and the common Islamic culture made the Arabs call each other brothers. Sometimes they don't listen to the appeals of the United Nations and superpowers, but they still respect the decisions of the Arab Summit. This time the kings and presidents met in the conference hall of the Cairo Parliament building, returned to persuade Iraq to stop at the brink. But Iraqi Vice President Hamadi refused. He said the current situation in Kuwait is not negotiable. The U.S. military proposed a plan to President Bush, completely destroy Iraq's oil exports, including pipelines, refineries, oil ports and oil pumping stations. This plan was eventually rejected. The reason is that Saddam's goal is to interfere with the world's oil supply. The U.S. response cannot be to bomb the world's oil supply. At this time, the U.S. reconnaissance satellite transmitted the latest intelligence back to the Pentagon. This information stunned the U.S. military. The 100,000 Iraqi troops that invaded Kuwait actually crossed Kuwait City and headed directly to the border of Saudi Arabia. It was not until then that the United States suddenly understood why Saddam would use a huge army to deal with Kuwait. It turned out that Saddam's conquest plan also included Saudi Arabia. When the Americans just realized that Saddam wanted to annex the entire southern Arab world, the tragedy in Kuwait has just begun. A large number of Kuwaitis were expelled from their homes and drifted to Saudi Arabia and other countries. More than 13,000 people died or disappeared. The remaining people were given a deadline to join Iraqi nationality. Kuwaiti refugees in Cairo denounce Iraqi military brutality. One after another, Kuwaiti refugees took to the podium to tell the world what the Iraqi army did in Kuwait. They looted the Central Bank of Kuwait. Republican guards robbed vault of $2.54 million ounces of gold and over $2 billion. Kuwait's oil facilities and factories were dismantled and shipped to Iraq. Kuwait's national treasures and private jewelry could not escape the fate of being swept away. Kuwaiti underground radio stations are calling on Arab brothers to urgently rescue Kuwait day and night. A begging appeal was issued from an underground radio station on the outskirts of Kuwait City. Arab brothers, Kuwait's life and honor have been violated. Come and save me. Kuwait's children, women and elderly people appeal to you. Faced with this call for help, the shocked Arab world did not respond. Although President Bush made impassioned speeches on the international stage from time to time, the United States firmly condemns Iraq's invasion and calls for unconditional withdrawal. The world today cannot tolerate such brutal aggression. But at this time, only the sound of Iraqi military boots could be heard in the vast Gobi Desert of the Persian Gulf. Saddam had already anticipated the dilemma he might face. What he is pursuing now is to occupy Kuwait in the shortest possible time. Use tough measures to make the weak international community recognize Iraq's annexation of Kuwait. He announced Kuwait as a province of Iraq amid cheers. And Baghdad's next target is Saudi Arabia, which has an area of 2.24 million square kilometers but only 70,000 troops. At this time, President Bush realized that there was no other way to stop the advance of the Iraqi army except military means, and there could be no delay. The Pentagon told President Bush, the Iraqi army has penetrated into the neutral zone between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Take up position 1 kilometer away from Saudi Arabia. If Iraq occupies Saudi ports and airports, they can cut off the Persian Gulf access and prevent the arrival of international aid. The Arab world has not given up on resolving the Gulf crisis through diplomatic means, but the United States no longer has any illusions at this time. While those Arabs with white cloth on their heads are busy with shuttle diplomacy, the United States is focusing on the issue of military strikes. The United States does not have a single army in the Middle East. Only a navy of nearly 10,000 people is deployed in the Persian Gulf. How to fight this war? The U.S. military implements a global strategy. The military command organization responsible for the Middle East and West Asia is called the Central Command. Normally, there are no troops, only 700 staff and other service personnel, stationed at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. The Central Command submitted a top-secret emergency action plan to the President. Its code name is 900-1002. 10-0 to the emergency action plan has been lying in the safe for 10 years. It was formulated in 1979. The Islamic Revolution broke out in Iran that year. The pro-American King Pahlavi was forced to leave. The exiled Iranian religious leader Khomeini returned to his country. The relationship between the United States and Iran deteriorated rapidly. Iran even took all American diplomats hostage. The then U.S. President Carter asked the army to formulate this secret plan in order to quickly deploy troops to the local area. 10-0 plan was formulated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the early 1980s to deal with the Soviet Union or Iran. The plan is to transport 100,000 troops to a certain area within 6 months. The core content of the plan is that once a crisis occurs in a certain area of the world, how long should the U.S. military take? What combat forces can be mobilized from all over the world? What combat aircraft? What aircraft carrier formations? What logistics support? What supplies and ammunition to carry out the mission? The plan is ready. It's just that after the Vietnam War, the American public is extremely sensitive to war. But according to American standards, ground war is called war. Therefore, sending ground troops is a matter of great importance. And sending aircraft and warships is a show of force. The public doesn't care much. After the Gulf crisis broke out, the first thing Bush could do was to order the task force in the Indian Ocean to move closer to the Gulf. He included the Independence aircraft carrier and 6 frigates. At the same time, Britain, France, and Canada also sent small fleets to the Persian Gulf. Italy, Spain, Germany, and Greece announced that the U.S. military could use their naval and air force bases when deploying troops to the Gulf. The framework of the United Nations force began to take shape at this time. As the U.S. task force entered the Persian Gulf, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff debated whether to implement Plan No. Lieutenant General Kelly, the Chief of Operations, opposed the implementation of the 10-0 plan. As a professional soldier, he admired the speed and fluidity of the Iraqi army when invading Kuwait. At the same time, he felt that this force was not easy to mess with. He said that the U.S. military should not be involved in the ground war in the Gulf. Politicians can fantasize as much as they want, but the military must face the reality. A direct tank battle with the Iraqi army will be complicated and difficult. He advocates airstrikes against Iraq. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Powell believes, if only airstrikes are carried out against Iraq, it will be of no use, and it will make Iraq angry at Saudi Arabia. Use occupation of Saudi Arabia to retaliate against the United States. Therefore, since it has been decided to fight, it is necessary to assemble in the Middle East through the 10-0 plan ground forces. Use ground warfare to defeat Saddam. The military debate will ultimately be decided by the president. President Bush rushed back to the White House and immediately held a press conference. Reporters repeatedly asked whether the United States would send troops. Bush dodged the question, which was a quiet muttering. Just wait and see, this cannot be tolerated. That same evening National Security Advisor Admiral Powell decided, prepare to send the 82 ND Airborne Division to Saudi Arabia immediately. He wanted Saddam to understand, as long as the Iraqi army attacked Saudi Arabia, it would inevitably engage in ground combat with the U.S. military. The next question is, what will the Soviet Union do if the U.S. sends troops to the Gulf? Although President Bush was not sure about this for the time being, he had been vice president under Reagan for 8 years after all. It is obvious that the momentum of the Soviet Union's confrontation with the United States is no longer as strong as before. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was on the eve of the Soviet Union's complete disintegration. Although the Soviet Black Sea Fleet sent ships to follow the U.S. task force into the Persian Gulf, but the Soviet ships did not intend to do anything and were unable to do anything. Just observing the development of the Gulf situation, the U.S. government noticed that the Soviet government also condemned Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. This condemnation is half indignation and half helpless. Anyway, the Soviet Union and Iraq have been allied for nearly 20 years. There are still a group of Soviet military advisors in the Iraqi army. It was not easy for the Soviet government to criticize its old friends. Thus, President Bush confirmed that the Soviet Union would not intervene once the United States taught Iraq a lesson. When the Soviet Union was no longer an obstacle, the implementation of the 10-0 plan by the U.S. military entered the substantive stage. The 82 ND Airborne Division of the United States is stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the United States. It has 3 brigades under its jurisdiction. It is the oldest unit in the U.S. Airborne Division. He fought some tough battles in World War II. He was the main force of the 5 airborne divisions of the U.S. military at that time. He went too many places after the war. The 82 ND Airborne Division was the main force in the U.S. military operations in Congo, Vietnam, Dominica, Grenada and Panama. 82 ND Airborne Division is ready to go. But it is not certain whether the Gulf countries will allow the U.S. troops to enter. For this reason, President Bush sent Secretary of Defense Cheney to Saudi Arabia to negotiate with King Fahd. Cheney showed the king the photos taken by the satellite and told him that Saudi Arabia might be facing the most serious threat in history. The king immediately agreed to the U.S. military stationed in Saudi Arabia. Cheney passed the news back to the United States by phone. Bush said, "Okay, let's do it." President Bush signed an action plan based on the 10-0 plan that night. The main purpose of the plan is to deploy troops in Saudi Arabia, prevent the Iraqi army from invading Saudi Arabia, and take all means to force Iraq to withdraw its troops from Kuwait. According to the plan, at 7:35 on August 7, the 2,300-man vanguard of the 82 ND Airborne Division boarded a plane at Fort Bragg in North Carolina and flew to Saudi Arabia. The plan calls for the Air Force to send 96 fighter jets, 72 bombers and 100 support aircraft to air bases in Saudi Arabia within 3 days. 180 fighters from 3 aircraft carriers will also join the plan within a week. When the entire plan is completed, The United States will have 600 aircraft of all kinds in the Gulf region. At the same time, U.S. Secretary of State Baker arrived in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, persuaded Turkey to close the Iraqi oil pipeline and deploy 14 F-117 stealth bombers in Turkey. Turkey agreed. In return, the United States provided $2 billion in economic aid. After the U.S. advance team arrived in Saudi Arabia on the evening of August 8, President Bush delivered a televised speech to the nation, announced that the United States would send troops to Saudi Arabia. The code name of this U.S. operation is Desert Shield. On the evening of August 990, dozens of large U.S. military transport planes flew over the desert in Saudi Arabia. The transport planes carried 2,300 troops from the 82nd Airborne Division. Most of them had a blank mind. They didn't even know how to spell the name of Saudi Arabia in English before stepping on the soft sand. They didn't bring any heavy equipment, only personal weapons. The U.S. military believed that their equipment was not much better than that of a police force. Saddam deployed 6 well-equipped divisions on the border of Saudi Arabia. Saddam was not a very rational person. He could order Iraqi troops across the border if he gets upset. So Powell said that these American boys were sheep sent to the wolves. But the arrival of the advanced troops in Saudi Arabia showed the determination of the United States. Bush's tired face appeared on the TV screen that night. He informed the whole country that the U.S. military had arrived in Saudi Arabia. He asked the American people to support this just action. He emphasized that the U.S. military's mission in Saudi Arabia was purely defensive. The U.S. military would not take the initiative to attack or provoke hostilities. Once the mission is completed, it will return home immediately. The president issued an order and the Desert Shield plan began to operate. Modern warfare cannot be separated from huge equipment and material support. Especially before the United States goes to war, it always has to pile up several mountains of materials. It seems that only by bringing the American lifestyle to a foreign land can we fight comfortably. It takes half the world to get from the United States to the Middle East. Completing long-distance, large-scale transportation is considered the key to the success of Operation Desert Shield. The United States has a large-scale military sealift command. It has several pre-positioned fleets dedicated to transporting equipment. This time, the United States not only organized large-scale sealift by the Military Sealift Command, but also included transport ships in the aircraft carrier formation heading to the Gulf. At the same time, two F-15 fighter squadrons of the Air Force flew for 15 hours to reach the Saudi Air Force Base. Since August 17, more than 400 fighters and bombers of various types from each Air Force have been stationed in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar and Oman. The 52 bombers have also moved to Diego Garcia Island in the Indian Ocean. The initial main force for implementing the Desert Shield plan is aircraft carriers. The 3 U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups, led by the Independence, Eisenhower and Saratoga, entered the Gulf of Oman, the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea to begin the blockade of Iraq. Aircraft carriers carry fleets of ships that transport ammunition, fuel and some combatants. This not only improves the response speed but also ensures the transportation of the first phase of combat supplies. According to the Washington Post, in the first 2 weeks of the U.S. military's entry into Saudi Arabia, 8 billion pounds of supplies were transported by sea, of which 1/3 were transported with the aircraft carrier fleet. The rest was transported by the prepositioned fleet of the Military Sealift Command. The other part was transported by air. The air transport was mainly for combatants. The U.S. military mobilized a large-scale air force. More than 300 long-range transport aircraft, such as C-5, were dispatched. They took off and landed at Saudi Arabian airports in a constant stream. More than 30 sorties a day. In this super-large-scale troop movement, soldiers only carried light weapons with them. Heavy equipment was transported by sea in large transport aircraft. Within a week of the 80th Airborne Division's advanced troops arriving in Saudi Arabia, the rest of the 82nd Airborne Division, 16,000 people from the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division, 16,000 people from the 101st Street Airborne Division, and 2 Marine brigades were transported to the Gulf. At the same time, 450,000 tons of supplies were airlifted. Fast transport ships loaded with tanks, trucks and logistical supplies took 12 days to travel from the east coast of the United States to Saudi Arabia. The first batch of U.S. military transport fleets loaded with heavy equipment arrived at the Saudi port of Khafj on August 24. The U.S. military dispatched ground forces for two main tasks. One is to defend the U.S. military bases in Saudi Arabia. The second is to delay the Iraqi army as much as possible and wait for the main force to arrive once Iraq launches an attack. According to the Desert Shield plan, the number of ground forces in Saudi Arabia will eventually reach 300,000. The Navy will maintain at least 3 aircraft carrier formations in the Gulf of Oman and the Red Sea at the exit of the Gulf. The Air Force will deploy 600 aircraft of various types in the Gulf region. The U.S. military has made it clear from the beginning that Operation Desert Shield is different from previous surgical operations that solve problems in a short period of time. He is deploying superior land, sea and air forces in a sensitive area that attracts attention and is ready to engage in a long-term, all-out war with a strong opponent. This time, the U.S. military has traveled half the world to gather troops in front of a powerful opponent. The U.S. military may be hit by the opponent at any time. Therefore, speeding up and increasing transportation has become a decisive factor in winning the first phase of the Gulf War. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Army Powell came to the U.S. military camp in Saudi Arabia for inspection. In order to coordinate and unify the command of the U.S. military, the Desert Shield Operation Command Center was established. Bush appointed Powell as the Commander-in-Chief. Schwarzkopf served as the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military in the Gulf region. The headquarters is located in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. Schwarzkopf is 92 meters tall and weighs 120 kilograms. He is aggressive and outspoken. His nickname in the upper echelons of the army is Big Bear or Big Cigar Norman. Because of his bad temper, he is also called Storm Norman. When he was the commander of the 24th Infantry Division, he often organized the division to train in the California desert in the United States. And every 2 years, he held a joint exercise with the Egyptian army in the desert area. He became the commander of the U.S. Central Command in April 1987. Since then, he began to study the Gulf issue. He had just organized a military exercise with the Middle East as the background 5 days before Iraq invaded Kuwait. When Bush could not come up with any practical solutions after Iraq invaded Kuwait, he took out the 10-OTA plan from the safe and recommended it to the president. After that, he assisted Powell in formulating the U.S. military's Rapid Response Desert Shield Operation Plan. Powell and Schwarzkopf went to the Saudi royal palace to visit Saudi King Fahd. According to American journalists, Schwarzkopf was most worried about King Fahd's compromise. Fearing that the world's most generous king would give Saddam billions of dollars to buy peace. King Fahd did this before, and now King Fahd saw that the United States was making such a big move, spending tens of millions of dollars every day to transport troops, tanks and equipment from the other side of the earth to the desert. He was afraid that the United States could not afford it and the whole operation would be abandoned halfway. So he joined forces with the Kuwaiti government in exiling the 3 countries of the United Arab Emirates to offer $12 billion to fund Operation Desert Shield. Saudi Arabia's attitude directly affected other countries in the Arab world. Of course, Arab countries were more worried about Iraq's arrogance and disregard for international law. In this way, Saudi Arabia's 70,000 troops and the remaining troops in Kuwait were all under the command of the U.S. military. Egypt, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar all proposed to send troops to join the multinational force. On August 18, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 664, reaffirming that Iraq's annexation of Kuwait was completely invalid. On August 25, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 665, which allowed UN members that deployed naval forces in the Gulf to intercept Iraqi shipping when necessary. This actually authorized the US and other countries' navies to blockade Iraq's trade. In the 45-year history of the United Nations, it is the first time that a member state is encouraged to punish a country without the banner of the United Nations Army. Since Western Europe is heavily dependent on Gulf oil, its reaction is also the most sensitive. The 9 Western European Union countries decided to prepare to send joint forces to the Gulf region. In fact, the international community has issued a pass to the United States to go to war. U.S. tanks have entered the desert for adaptive training. This is the first time in nearly half a century since World War II that the United States is preparing to fight a country with almost no allies with the strong support of the international community. Never before has a country been so isolated as Iraq. Now it depends on what the United States is going to do. Iraq has deployed 100,000 troops on the Saudi border, including the most advanced Soviet-made T-72 heavy tanks. So the United States also transported tank troops from its homeland to Saudi Arabia as quickly as possible. The 78th Expeditionary Brigade of the U.S. Marine Corps was the first heavy-equipped ground force to arrive in Saudi Arabia. He has the most advanced M1 main battle tank in active service in the U.S. military. They immediately formed an armored patrol after entering the desert, patrolling and conducting reconnaissance in the desert to show their strength and deter opponents. The U.S. military is also accelerating battlefield preparations to clear obstacles and mines for the tank's passages. Since the start of Operation Desert Shield, the U.S. Air Force has deployed a large number of advanced combat aircraft to the Gulf region. These include the F-117A stealth bomber, with the strongest penetration capability. At that time, this type of aircraft was speculated by the outside world for many years. It was not until 1988 that the U.S. military officially acknowledged the existence of this aircraft. B-52 Stratofortress is the only bomber in the U.S. Air Force that can fly long distances and drop a large number of bombs. The U.S. has concentrated 70 B-52s in its battlefield preparations in the Gulf. Since September 4, the U.S. has secretly deployed fighter jets to 3 Gulf countries, including the UAE, Qatar, and Oman, in addition to Saudi Arabia. These include the U.S. Air Force's main air superiority fighters, the F-15 and F-16. They are all the most advanced third-generation fighters in the world. F-18 is an active carrier-based attack aircraft of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. It is mainly used for fleet air defense and can also perform ground attack missions. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff said that the Air Force was more efficient in terms of the speed of implementing the Desert Shield plan. In fact, the U.S. Navy was also not slow in action. Since the 1980s, the U.S. Navy has regarded forward defense and rapid response as important operational principles. After the Gulf crisis broke out, 8 surface ships of the U.S. Middle East Task Force stationed in Bahrain immediately left the port to carry out patrol missions. Then the United States deployed more than 10 cruisers to the Gulf, including 9 Aegis missile cruisers. At the same time, more than 10 destroyers and numerous frigates and amphibious assault ships were dispatched. By the beginning of September, the U.S. Navy had 55 surface ships at designated locations. It is planned that by the beginning of November, there will be 88 ships of various types. This is a considerable maritime force. When the emergency deployment of the U.S. military began to take shape, the British Army began to deploy troops to the Gulf. Since the Central European confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact no longer existed, the British dared to use the British Ace Group stationed in Germany, the vanguard of the British 78th Armoured Brigade. Set sail from Bremen port and arrived in Saudi Arabia in early September. Prince Charles also took the British Challenger main battle tank to the British base in the desert. On September 21, the United States entered the 6th week of implementing the Desert Shield Plan. When Arafat went to Baghdad to mediate again, Saddam said that Iraq would not only not withdraw its troops from Kuwait. If the U.S. military attacked Iraq, then this war would become the mother of battles in the history of human warfare. The U.S. military judged that Saddam was too tensioned in a bad mood through his series of words and deeds. People with bad moods can do anything, including using chemical weapons. After entering the desert, the U.S. military focused on anti-gas training. Iraq does have chemical weapons. After the Fourth Middle East War, Iraq sought to offset Israel's nuclear advantage. Using the remaining ethnic antagonism after World War I, it asked German scientists to help build chemical weapons factories, which can produce meson gas. Since Iraq has a considerable number of ground-to-ground missiles, so the delivery of poison gas bombs is not a problem. But the Israelis were not hit by poison gas bombs. In the later period of the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian troops fell in the poison gas one after another. In coordination with chemical defense, the U.S. military has established a 3-dimensional medical support system for the Desert Shield program to meet the needs of rapid medical care and evacuation of the wounded and sick. The U.S. military has strengthened the Army and division-level field hospitals in the Gulf region. The field hospital for logistics alone has 500 beds. At the same time, there is a helicopter company for evacuating the wounded. The division field hospital is required to be opened 5 kilometers away from the front line, and armored ambulances equipped with operating tables can be driven to a section 800 meters away from the front line. Each armored ambulance has 8 beds and 2 operating tables. At the same time, the U.S. military has also deployed an air hospital converted from a C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft in Saudi Arabia. By the end of September, the U.S. military had deployed more than 100,000 ground troops to the Gulf. Because the desert ground is too soft, it is difficult for artillery to move. The U.S. military did not deploy special artillery units this time. All the artillery required for the operation is provided by heavy tanks and self-propelled artillery, of which 3 are M1 tanks. The speed of these tanks and self-propelled artillery is twice that of the Iraqi T-70. The tank can flexibly transfer positions, use high-speed impact to catch the opponent off guard. The 120 Smut Harper gun it is equipped with is made in Germany. The tail-stabilized armor-piercing projectile equipped can penetrate 70 armor plates. After the rapid and large-scale assembly of the U.S. military in Saudi Arabia, Saddam's attack on Saudi Arabia is becoming less and less likely. Saddam's 430,000 troops in the war zone are building a stronger defensive position. This shows that Saddam has switched from offense to defense to effectively strike the Iraqi army's large number of Soviet-made tanks. The U.S. military even shipped the Army tactical missiles that were just trial-produced a few months ago to Saudi Arabia. This missile is only 4 meters long and weighs 1.5 tons. The maximum range is 145 kilometers. The hit accuracy is about 50 meters. The warhead contains 950 submunitions to kill personnel and light armored targets, mainly used to strike enemy assembled troops, armored vehicles, missile launch sites, command centers, and other targets. Later, it was proved that this type of cluster missile played a unique role in the actual combat of the Gulf War. At the beginning of the implementation of the Desert Shield Plan, almost no one knew how many troops the United States would deploy to the Gulf region. During the Vietnam War, the peak number of U.S. troops in Vietnam reached 580,000. By October 14, the United States announced that the total number of U.S. troops in the Gulf had exceeded 200,000. On August 22, U.S. President Bush ordered the recruitment of 200,000 U.S. military reservists to rush to the Gulf battlefield. The entire United States has been mobilized. At this time, the United States has assembled a large group of heavy troops in the Gulf region. In the words of an American general, the United States seems to be going to fight the Third World War. But since the Desert Shield Plan started, the U.S. military's thinking has changed. The gathering of multinational forces in the Gulf made the Iraqi army neither willing nor able to attack Saudi Arabia. Therefore, the mission of the Desert Shield Plan to stop and defend Saudi Arabia has become meaningless. The U.S. military cannot endure the scorching heat with a surface temperature of up to 40 degrees for a long time. Hundreds of thousands of troops cannot afford to waste time or delay in the scorching desert. For a time, the wave of war in the United States overwhelmed the wave of anti-war. Whether in big cities or small towns, the national flag was hung in front of almost every house. The songs of people praising the Virgin Mary in the church were particularly sad and sincere. The scene of family members bidding farewell in tears was all over the United States. The national sentiment and pride of the American people were once again reawakened. When the wave of public opinion calling for an attack came, Bush made a strong speech. He said, Saddam claimed that he was conducting an Arab jihad. The person who said this was the one who released the poison gas, the one who invaded Iran and killed more than 500,000 Muslims, and the one who was plundering Kuwait. At this time, the whole United States was bidding farewell to the reservists. Navy reservists set off to the Gulf to take on tasks such as dock loading and unloading of marine medical services. More than 30,000 Air Force reservists formed 7 squadrons and went to the Gulf. They trained together with the active Air Force under the command of the Air Force Commandant and directly participated in airstrikes after the war began. The Marine Corps recruited more than 30,000 reservists, most of whom were retired veterans of the Marine Corps, and deployed them to the Middle East as reinforcements. They went to the front and directly participated in the battle. The U.S. Coast Guard is not a military organization, but is under the leadership of the Department of Transportation of the State Department. This was the case during World War II. For the first time in its history, more than 600 reservists have been called up to serve as Coast Guard personnel in the Middle East. In the late autumn of 1990, Americans took to the streets to see off their relatives. This move by the people was equivalent to issuing a license to the president to go to war against Iraq. The United States fought for nearly 100 years in the 20th century. The First World War saw the great powers divide the world. It was a brutal and thrilling fight. The United States participated and became the winner. But it did not cause any response among the people. The United States participated in World War II, expedition to Europe and the Pacific. defeat the German, Japanese and fascists. The whole country still takes it as honor and pride. In the Korean War, the United States assembled 16 countries to fight against the volunteer army of one country. In the Vietnam War, the United States spent money and lost troops to maintain a corrupt government. It was 15 years after the end of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, the whole United States angrily protested the government for sending U.S. troops into the jungles and rice fields of Vietnam. But this time, the Americans resolutely sent their loved ones into the deserts and oil fields of the Gulf. Even in the same war, people's attitudes can be worlds apart. As the saying goes, a righteous cause has many supporters, while an unrighteous cause has few supporters. On August 161,990, when Iraq had occupied Kuwait for a full half-month, Iraqi President Saddam announced a new decision to detain all Americans and British living in Kuwait, put them in a hotel, and from that moment on Saddam, the Desert Shield against the United States, showed the world shocking hostage shield. There are more foreigners in Kuwait than locals. On August 17, the Iraqi government announced that all citizens of countries hostile to Iraq were not allowed to leave the country. The Western hostages held by Iraq include not only men but also women and children. They were transported to where Iraq thought they should go. Iraq held about 10,000 Western hostages, including about 4,000 from Britain, about 3,000 from the United States, about 300 from Germany, about 350 from Japan, about 330 from France, about 300 from Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Canada and other countries about 1,000. On August 25, the Iraqi army surrounded the embassies of various countries in Kuwait, claiming that Kuwait had merged with Iraq. The embassies of various countries in Kuwait became illegal institutions. At the same time, the Iraqi Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that, since August 25, all diplomats from 64 foreign countries stationed in Kuwait have lost their diplomatic immunity. They are regarded as ordinary expatriates and are prohibited from leaving the country. These Western diplomats have all become hostages. The construction of Kuwait mainly relies on foreign labor. Although Iraq only detained Western hostages, Asian and African laborers also left in order to escape the war, forming a refugee population of millions. In addition, some Westerners were unwilling to be held hostage. They tried every means to escape from danger. A series of human tragedies of escape were staged. Foreign workers flocked to the border. There were 500,000 refugees entering Jordan alone. President Bush warned Saddam, "Our ambassador is being tortured by a dictator. Let's wait and see." Using hostages as shields as a terrorist act has been condemned by world public opinion. In modern history, there is almost no country that has detained tens of thousands of hostages as a means of threatening the other party in the name of a country. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher also warned Saddam that Britain cannot hold any negotiations with Iraq on the hostage issue. But for Saddam, hostages are really shields. On August 18, the Iraqi government officially announced that it had detained all people from hostile countries stranded in Iraq and Kuwait and placed them in military camps, refineries, and drinking water purification plants that might be attacked by airstrikes. If the multinational forces launch an attack on Iraq, these detained foreigners will become the first victims. British and Americans account for 70% of all hostages detained in Iraq. For this reason, former British Prime Minister Sis rushed to Baghdad to meet with Saddam, demanding that the Iraqi government release elderly and sick British hostages. Saddam pretended to be generous and gave Sis a face. Saddam agreed to let some British people leave Baghdad and return home. Because Western governments do not accept hostage blackmail, refused to negotiate with the Iraqi government on the hostage issue. Therefore, only Western politicians can mediate the hostage issue. They went to Baghdad to meet Saddam as civilian representatives to rescue the hostages. These people also include former Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone, Austrian President Waldheim and others. But countries did not give in on the hostage issue. On August 18, the United Nations passed Resolution 664, requiring Iraq to allow third country nationals to leave Iraq and Kuwait. No action should be taken to endanger the safety or health of these third country nationals, asking the Iraqi government to withdraw its orders to close diplomatic and consular missions of various countries in Kuwait and to cancel the immunity of mission personnel. Resolution 666, passed on September 13, reiterated these requirements and emphasized Iraq's guarantee of the safety and life of the hostages, bear full responsibility. Saddam ignored the UN resolution. Before the UN decided to take military sanctions, it could only take economic sanctions. The UN called on all countries to stop all important export activities with Iraq and Kuwait, not to use their own ships to transfer any goods for these two countries, and called on member states to intercept all Iraqi sea transport in order to check and verify the destination of its goods. On August 18, the U.S. warship fired a warning shot at an Iraqi oil tanker for the first time. From this day on, the U.S. Navy has unequivocally intercepted and inspected all ships entering and leaving the port of Basra. The attitude reflected in this is that even if thousands of hostages are sacrificed, they will never give in. U.S. congressmen threatened to destroy Iraq on a massive scale if even one American hostage was harmed. Not long after the United Nations imposed economic sanctions, the intelligence collected by the U.S. military showed that 95% of Iraq's imports and almost all exports had been cut off. The U.S. Navy continued to carry out a strict naval blockade. Iraq is a food importing country. As soon as its food import channel was blocked, it played the hostage card. The Iraqi authorities said that the shortage of imported food forced us to decide to treat the babies of overseas expatriates in our own way. That is, to treat them the same as our babies. The implication is that Iraq will first reduce the food for foreign expatriates. It is the hostages, especially American hostages, that are first affected by the United Nations economic sanctions. Then Iraq proposed that if they wanted the hostages to return home, they would use airplanes to transport food in exchange. But the blockade is still going on. The Baghdad authorities took advantage of the difficulties caused by the economic sanctions to Iraq to organize people to march on demonstrate. They shouted slogans such as, "We will eat dates and drink water, but will never surrender." An 11-year-old girl wrote a letter to President Bush. In the letter, she said, "Mr. President, I can live without Pepsi, which is not serious, but what will you do without oil?" In fact, Iraq's oil exports, which accounted for 95% of the country's foreign exchange income, had been cut off. The channels that relied on imports for 2/3 of food were also cut off. Since late August, Iraq's food prices have soared 6 times. The country began to implement rationing of basic necessities. At this time, even though the United States had thousands of men, women and children in Saddam's hands, its attitude became even tougher. Schwarzkopf, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Gulf garrison, proposed that, if the United States wanted to launch an attack on Iraq, the U.S. garrison in the Gulf region would have to increase by 200,000. That is, the original number would be doubled to 400,000 troops. Schwarzkopf said he will now double his military strength. The Air Force will double. The Navy will double. The Marine Corps and ground forces will double. The number of aircraft carriers will increase from 3 to 6. It is reported that when he said this in the White House conference room, White House officials were surprised at first and then looked embarrassed. But the U.S. military strongly supports him. They only want him to do one thing, which troops he wants, and make a list. Schwarzkopf said that if he is serious about the attack, he must hand over the 70th Army to me. This was an unthinkable request in the past. The 70th Army of the United States stationed in Germany was a central force in the Cold War confrontation between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Now even if the Warsaw Pact begins to fall apart, but the 70th Army cannot just leave. So President Bush hesitated and only agreed to send the 1st Street Armored Division and the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment of the 70th Army to the Gulf. The 1st Street Armored Division of the 70th Army is also known as the Old Warriors. It is the earliest established unit in the U.S. Armored Forces and is regarded as the ancestor of the U.S. Armored Forces. The establishment is 17,000 people. At full strength, there are 348 M1 tanks, and all of them are the latest M1 main battle tanks. 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. 127 helicopters of various types. At the same time, it is equipped with quite strong missile and artillery forces. Since the 70th Army was not mobilized as a whole, Powell proposed that there was a division that had trained with the 70th Army and whose equipment level was not worse than that of the 70th Army. He is now stationed in the country, that is, the 1st Street Division of the United States, and the 1st Street Mechanized Infantry Division. He was the first batch of troops to participate in the 2 World Wars. At the same time, it was the unit with the heaviest casualties in the Vietnam War. In this way, almost all the ace troops of the U.S. Army were sent to the Gulf. The United States not only mobilized the 70th Army stationed in Europe, but also mobilized the 5th Army of the United States Army stationed in Europe. The 3rd Armored Division of the 5th Army is stationed in Frankfurt, Germany, and is one of the main forces of the U.S. troops stationed in Europe. The division is known as the Spearhead and is famous for its fierce attacks and charges. During World War II, he suffered nearly 10,000 casualties in more than 200 days of fighting. He was the unit with the heaviest casualties in the U.S. Armored Forces, so that he had to be disbanded and reorganized after the war. In addition, the main force of the U.S. Marine Corps almost went out in full force. The 1st Street Marine Division stationed in Hawaii, the 2nd Marine Division stationed in Virginia, the 3rd Marine Division stationed in Okinawa, Japan, all sent to the Gulf region. It can be said that this is the longest and largest strategic transportation in human history. Since the first batch of 2,300 officers and soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division set foot on the Saudi desert on August 18, the United States has assembled 480,000 troops in the war's own in nearly 4 months until early December. What kind of concept is this? The straight-line flight distance from the east coast of the United States to the Persian Gulf is 11,987 kilometers. The straight-line flight distance from the west coast of the United States to the Persian Gulf is 13,113 kilometers. The ocean transport line from Charleston Port in the United States to the Strait of Hormuz through the Suez Canal is 13,274 kilometers. Around F reclaws 18,500 kilometers. From San Diego to the Strait of Hormuz is 18,466 kilometers. From Diego Garcia Island to the Strait of Hormuz is 4,023 kilometers. The 80th Airborne Division, 101st Street Air Assault Division, 24th Mechanized Infantry Division, 197th Mechanized Infantry Brigade, and 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, which were airlifted from North Carolina and Georgia in the United States to the northeastern border of Saudi Arabia, were all transported by air in an organized manner. The 3rd Army, which was airlifted from Texas, the United States to the northeastern border of Saudi Arabia, includes the 1st Street Cavalry Division, the 2nd Armored Division, the 1st Street Mechanized Infantry Division, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the 3rd Army Artillery, which were all airlifted in an integrated manner. The 5th Army, which was airlifted from Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, Germany to the northeastern border of Saudi Arabia, includes the 3rd Division in the 12th Combat Aviation Brigade, which were also airlifted in an integrated manner. The 7th Army, which was airlifted from Moosbach and Nuremberg, Germany to the northeastern border of Saudi Arabia, includes the 1st Street Armored Division and the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, which were also airlifted in an integrated manner. The 1st Street Expeditionary Force, which includes the 5th Expeditionary Brigade and the 70th Expeditionary Brigade, were also airlifted directly from the United States and the Hawaiian Islands in the Pacific to the northeastern border of Saudi Arabia. The 2nd Expeditionary Force includes the 40th Expeditionary Brigade and the 60th Expeditionary Brigade. The 3rd Expeditionary Force is under the command of the 1st Expeditionary Brigade. This strategic transport is simply a transatlantic relocation operation for the U.S. military. An armored division consumes 5,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 gallons of fuel and 80,000 rations per day and night. If the U.S. military wants to reserve 60 days of supplies for the 400,000 troops fighting on the ground, more than 6 million tons will have to be transported from the U.S. mainland alone. The United States has assembled 6 aircraft carrier battle groups in this area. The USS Kennedy, the USS America and the USS Saratoga aircraft carrier battle groups are deployed in the Red Sea. The USS Ranger, the USS Midway, and the USS Roosevelt aircraft carrier battle groups are deployed in the Persian Gulf, including the USS Independence, USS San Howard, the USS Forrestal that were added later. A total of 9 aircraft carriers were deployed. The U.S. military has concentrated nearly 1,000 combat aircraft in this area, deployed in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, Syria and Turkey. The naval carrier-based aircraft are deployed with the aircraft carrier battle groups in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Among them are B-52s carrying air-launched cruise missiles. There are stealth F-117s for long-range strikes. There are F-15s with strong electronic warfare capabilities. There are also F-16s that directly support ground combat. The Arab Joint Forces that have joined the multinational forces are nearly 170,000 people, and their deployment is as follows. Deployed in Saudi Arabia and the UAE are Egypt's 2 armored mechanized divisions, 2 infantry divisions, and 3 assault battalions, Syria's 1 armored division, 2 infantry brigades, and Morocco's 2 brigades. Deployed in Saudi Arabia are Pakistan's 1 division, Bangladesh's 2 brigades, Niger's 1 battalion, and Kuwait's 2 brigades into flying squadrons. As multinational and Arab coalition forces gathered in the Gulf, Saddam admitted that he felt a sense of national crisis. But he also said that if he had to choose between withdrawal and war, he would choose war. But how much strength does he have to fight against it? He mobilized about 1 million troops in the army, 9 armored divisions, 5 mechanized divisions, 18 motorized infantry divisions, 31 infantry divisions, 63 divisions in total, 5,500 main battle tanks, 500 T-72 MiZ, 500 T-72-1 TCG, 1,500 Chinese-made T-59 and T-16, 1,500 Soviet-made T-62, 1,500 Soviet-made T-54 and Romanian-made T-277, 30 British-made Chieftains captured from Iran, 2,500 armored reconnaissance vehicles, 1,500 infantry fighting vehicles, 6,000 armored personnel carriers, about 500 self-propelled artillery pieces, about 3,100 towed artillery pieces, and thousands of other types of artillery pieces, ITACSIS missile launchers, 200 rocket launchers, more than 600 anti-aircraft missiles, 4,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces all Soviet-made, 489 helicopters, all Soviet-made, 159 of which are armed helicopters. Total number of Air Force aircraft, 1048, including the bomber squadrons, 22 attack squadrons, 17 fighter squadrons, 2 transport squadrons, 337 training and liaison aircraft, 1 large naval destroyer built by Yugoslavia, 16 missile patrol boats, 6 torpedo patrol boats, about 35 coastal patrol aircraft, 2 mine layers, 10 amphibious combat ships. The weapons and equipment obtained from Kuwait include Hawk air defense missile system provided by the United States, 150 British Chieftain tanks, 70 other types of tanks, 80 British armored vehicles, 36 American 155 automatic howitzers, 200 Soviet-made armored infantry vehicles, 200 American M113 tanks, 12 American missile launchers. Saddam knew that Iraq, as a regional power, could not compete with the world's top power, the United States. But he even fired a warning shot in front of the people of Baghdad to show his toughness. Outsiders analyzed that instead of withdrawing troops in disgrace, he would rather be an Arab hero who goes against the United States. November 2090 is an ominous day for this hero. The United Nations, fed up with it, passed Resolution 678. The resolution set a deadline of January 151,991. If Iraq still does not withdraw its troops from Kuwait after this deadline, UN member states can take all necessary measures to uphold and implement UN resolutions. It is reported that the term necessary measures was worked out by the US and Soviet foreign ministers and refers to the use of force. Saddam, who was holding out at the other end of the desert, would not retreat in disgrace under the pressure of the US Army. So no matter what resolution the United Nations makes, a war is inevitable. Resolution 678 is like an ultimatum. The day after he made the announcement, President Bush gave Saddam a way out. The United States invited Iraqi Foreign Minister Iz to visit the United States from December 13 to 15. After that, U.S. Secretary of State Baker will return to visit Iraq. This is a delicate moment. Iraq immediately announced that it accepted the U.S. president's suggestion. The next day, Baghdad TV broadcast a video of Saddam personally visiting British hostages. Saddam called a little boy from a British hostage detention center to his side and asked him if he had milk to drink. This shot was repeatedly played by Baghdad TV. The uncle who asked the question did not look like a kind person, and the pale British boy was at a loss. How did the child answer? Whether he could drink milk? Baghdad TV did not say. In fact, this is also a gesture by Iraq, and all news media around the world are waiting for the action behind this gesture. This action is that the Iraqi government suddenly announced on December 7 to release all foreign citizens detained in Iraq and Kuwait. From then on, the hostages took their suitcases and set out on the road back to their homeland. The hostages were certainly happy about this, but the international community reacted coldly. believing that this move was just a buffer to Resolution 678 in response to the U.S. proposal, and the fundamental problem was far from being solved. The fundamental problem was the withdrawal of troops from Kuwait. But for the hostages, they were lucky enough to escape before the world's military forces were about to collide in the Middle East. It should be said that God blessed them. January, 151,991 was like a sword hanging over Saddam's head. Once this day came, the military forces to punish Iraq would come in waves, and the Iraqis could not stop the bombing with anger. Neither the United States nor Iraq was willing to give up the last chance for negotiations before the war. By mutual agreement, the two foreign ministers held talks in Geneva on January 1991. At this time, there were only 6 days left before the deadline stipulated by the United Nations. If the talks failed again this time, there would be no chance in the future. But they still failed after 6 hours of talks. Later, Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz told U.S. Secretary of State Baker that we have made the worst plan. If the United States attacks Iraq, we will not feel any difference. We have experience in war. On January 12, UN Secretary General Dicular arrived in Baghdad and talked with Saddam for 3 hours. This was the last mediation of the United Nations, but no progress was made. At this time, there were only 3 days left before the stipulated deadline. When all paths to peace were closed, the boiling Baghdad suddenly became quiet. The only ending is war. When I was collecting historical materials, I saw this and found that Saddam was not only shameless but also stupid. The whole of Iraq was dragged into the abyss by Saddam. Since he became the president of Iraq, Iraq has been in constant misfortune. In order to become the leader of the Arab world, it attacked Shiite Iran. It fought for 8 years and caused the country's economy to collapse. Then it invaded Kuwait and turned Iraq into the enemy of the world. When I saw that the United States had assembled 500,000 troops in the Gulf and its allies contributed more than 200,000 troops, I thought that Saddam would definitely die. Otherwise, were these more than 700,000 troops here for tourism? How much money was consumed every day? However, the United States actually gave Saddam a chance to negotiate, which completely overturned my perception of the United States. It did not ask Saddam to surrender, but only asked Saddam to withdraw his troops. The strategic transportation capabilities demonstrated by the U.S. military in the past few months have fully reflected the U.S. military's strong organizational capabilities, strong logistical strength, and the United States' strong productivity, and the international community's solidarity has shown that the world really intends to beat Iraq. And Iraq, a rookie that can't even beat Iran, actually fantasizes about beating the United States. I previously described in detail how the U.S. military transferred 500,000 troops from the other side of the earth to Saudi Arabia in order to let readers feel the power of the U.S. military. But Saddam obviously felt nothing. I can only say that weakness is not an obstacle to survival, stupidity is. Bush was asked by reporters more than once during those days what he would do on January 15th. Bush said his catchphrase, "Let's wait and see." According to the combat plan against the Iraqi army formulated by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the war started with a large-scale airstrike on Iraq, bombing targets in Iraq and Kuwait. The ground offensive will begin in 30 days. The Joint Chiefs of Staff drew up a list of targets. The targets for bombing were divided into 12 categories and ranked in order of priority. According to the priority, bombing command, control and communication systems, bombing air defense systems and radars, bombing the Iraqi Air Force's airfields, bombing Iraq's Scud missile launch sites, bombing Iraq's nuclear reactors, bombing Iraq's chemical and biological weapons production and storage facilities, bombing the Iraqi Republican Guard, bombing Iraq's supply network, including warehouses, ammunition depots, transportation hubs, bridges and railways, bombing 12 major petrochemical facilities, bombing the power system, bombing other industrial facilities supporting the war, bombing the 400,000 Iraqi troops occupying Kuwait. The war is coming. President Bush came to the U.S. military camp in Saudi Arabia. While he was visiting the U.S. soldier stationed there, Congress sent him a message. If you want to teach Saddam a lesson with war, you have to go to Congress to see if Congress allows you to fight. The authority of the U.S. Congress and the President in the matter of war is a bit messy. The United States has fought 100 or 200 wars since its founding. However, only 5 times were wars officially declared after authorization by Congress. The Korean War and the Vietnam War were both fought in a muddle. The military was not satisfied with this. If a country is going to war, it must have a clear statement. For this reason, the U.S. Congress officially debated the Gulf War as the day when the war may break out approaches. The anti-war sentiment in the United States is also gradually rising. The anti-war faction has both rational and emotional considerations. The former said that the world is imposing economic sanctions on Iraq. This strict economic blockade, even if we can't see results within half a year, we will see results in 12 to 18 months. At that time, Iraq will surrender without a fight. Therefore, the United States does not need to mobilize troops to deal with it by force. The latter quoted a famous American writer Mark Twain and said, "People can fight to defend their homes but not to defend their dormitories." They asked, "What are Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to the United States?" "It is neither an American home nor an American dormitories. It is just a shed for storing firewood for the winter. Therefore the Americans do not we should fight for these two distant countries. There is no need to throw the lives of American boys in the desert." Parades against the Gulf War were held in 19 cities including New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc. These public objections were fed back to Congress, making the debate in Congress particularly intense. The U.S. Senate and House of Representatives began debating on January 91991. At this time, there were only 6 days left before the January 15 deadline set by the United Nations. The focus of the congressional debate was that Iraq must get out of Kuwait. But the question is whether it is necessary to use American blood and bombs to drive them out. Some congressmen strongly opposed the war in their speeches. But after leaving Congress, he wrote to his son in Saudi Arabia saying, "Don't be influenced by your father's views, fulfill your military duties, and fight when the battle comes." The whole United States supports the young people in the desert. After 3 days of debate, the House and Senate voted on January 12. The House of Representatives passed a resolution authorizing the president to liberate Kuwait by force, if necessary by 250 votes to 183. The two factions in the Senate were roughly evenly matched. But in the end the authorization resolution was passed by 52 votes to 47. The result of this vote is equivalent to declaring war on Iraq. This is the first declaration of war by the U.S. Congress since it declared war on Japan on December 71, 1941. The countdown to the outbreak of the Gulf War has begun. The British Parliament also granted Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher the right to go to war. There is no other choice to resolve the Gulf crisis except war. French President Mitterrand was also authorized to order the French army to directly participate in the battle to liberate Kuwait. The deadline of January 15 on the last day, U.S. Secretary of State Baker arrived at the Saudi front and issued the president's order to attack Iraq. The campaign was codenamed Desert Storm. The offensive plan was divided into 4 phases. The first 3 phases would be air operations. The 4th phase would be a ground attack. The first phase was to launch air strikes on Iraq's command, control and communications systems. The purpose was to cut off Saddam's connection with the troops stationed in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The second phase would be a real-time and continuous bombing of Iraq's supply and munitions, base transportation vehicles, in order to cut off the supply of the Iraqi army. The third phase will be to carry out air strikes on the Iraqi ground forces, mainly the Republican Guard. Then comes the 4th phase and launches a ground offensive. January 15th is here. Saddam prayed to Allah anxiously, hoping that the Iraqi army could withstand the large-scale offensive of the U.S. military. But the U.S. military did not move all day on January 15th. Saddam has no illusions. This is just a short period of silence before the war. The United States is scheduled to the attack was launched at 3 a.m. Saudi time on January 171,991. That is 19 hours after the UN deadline. In fact, it was 7 p.m. January 16 Washington time. That is, in the primetime news at 7 p.m. All of America will see that a Middle East war has begun. According to the weather report, the weather was actually clear but there was no moon. This is a key factor in the deployment of stealth fighter bombers. Bush approved his plan and specifically proposed the first batch of bombs when confirming the target's autumn statue in the Arch of Triumph in Baghdad must be blown up, and the code name of the operation was changed from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. At about 123,526 Baghdad time, a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb dropped by an F-117 stealth bomber from 2 kilometers away accurately fell on the rooftop platform of the News and Communications building in downtown Baghdad. The point was exactly the center of the white mark where the helicopter was parked. This powerful bomb penetrated from the roof to the bottom floor. The building suddenly collapsed and turned into ashes in an instant. The 116-day deadlock in the Gulf crisis was finally broken, and the Gulf War that shocked the world was born. The White House spokesman announced to the world that the operation to liberate Kuwait had begun. In the fierce airstrikes, the Iraqis could not figure out which direction the airstrikes came from. They only felt that there were planes everywhere above their heads. In fact, the combat aircraft of the multinational forces have taken off from bases in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Syria, and are divided into 4 directions: east, west, south, and north, heading straight for the central target. January 17, multinational forces carried out a wave of bombing every 3 hours on targets in Iraq and Kuwait. The 3 waves of bombing involved more than 1,300 sorties and dropped 18,000 tons of bombs. At 500 p.m. Baghdad time, President Bush addressed the people of the world at the White House. He said that tonight, when our troops were fighting, I pray for them and their families. May God bless our troops. The bombing planes returned one after another at 600 p.m. Baghdad time. The planes that returned safely to crew showed an uncontrollable excitement, but the multinational forces lost 7 aircraft on this day. The next morning, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Gulf Forces, Schwarzkopf, held the first press conference after the start of Desert Storm in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. According to him, under Air Force Commander Horner, 51 of the 52 Tomahawk cruise missiles used in actual combat for the first time hit the target. The other missile did not miss the target but was stuck and not launched. 100 of the Tomahawks launched hit the target. This bombing used a large number of electronic optical guided bombs and laser guided bombs. These 2 types of bombs are conventional bombs with guidance and control equipment installed at the front and rear eye, EDV cameras, or infrared sensors. After the bomb is dropped, once it approaches the target, the operator will lock the camera sensor aimed at the target, and the bomb can complete the task by itself. This bomb is so accurate that it can be directly dropped into the chimney of a building. A desert storm overnight changed Baghdad beyond recognition. The thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of bombs of the multinational forces will inevitably affect the peaceful residents in the process of attacking Iraq's strategic and military targets. The U.S. military estimated that the number of residents killed by this was 2,000 before the war, and judging from the situation on the first day, if the war continues like this, the number of Iraqi civilians killed by the bombs by the end of the operation can only be far higher than the expected number. Iraq had taken sufficient precautions before the war, built a large number of air defense facilities, and repeatedly practiced air defense weapons. But in actual combat, it was discovered that the Iraqis were using low-tech air defense equipment to deal with high-tech airstrike weapons from the 1980s. The air defense equipment purchased from the Soviet Union and France was almost powerless against the U.S. airstrikes. 5 hours after Baghdad was reduced to ruins, Saddam made a radio speech. He said that the Holy War had begun. Against the devil Bush and the evil Zionists, the battle against Islam has begun. The brave Iraqis who hold high the torch of Islam will win in the end. A few hours after his speech, in the early morning of the 18th, Iraq launched several Scud missiles from the missile launch site in the west at Israel, thereby adding a missile war against infidel Israel to the Gulf War. This is an important part of Saddam's strategy. The purpose is to drag Israel into the war, turn a war against Iraq into a full-scale Middle East war. According to Saddam's wishful thinking, Israel, which was attacked, would be involved in the Gulf War as long as it fought back. The strong anti-Israel sentiment in the Arab world will cause Arab countries to stand on the side of Iraq. The anti-Iraqi alliance, originally formed with Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Syria as the core, will be divided. Arab countries that have participated in the multinational force will at least remain neutral. Iran and other countries that had been neutral will lean towards Iraq. In this way, Iraq's isolation will be improved. The Scud missile is a ground-to-ground missile developed by the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Its flight speed is not high and it only has an inertial guidance system. The trajectory is easier to calculate, so it can be intercepted. The Iraqis developed the Hussein missile based on the Scud-B missile. In this Gulf combat, neither the Scud nor the Hussein missiles are a match for the American Patriot missiles. The United States is well aware that Israel, which has been repeatedly attacked by missiles, will have disastrous consequences if it joins the war. So it tries its best to persuade Israel to be patient. The strong Israel swallowed its anger and did not join the war against Iran. Watching one Scud missile after another explode in the capital Tel Aviv, the United States transported more Patriot missiles to Israel. From January 18 to 30, Iraq launched a total of 54 Scud missiles at Saudi Arabia and Israel. 33 missiles were intercepted by Patriot missiles. The Israelis finally restrained themselves with the help of Patriots. Although Tel Aviv was bombed to a mess, Israel never retaliated against Iraq. Since the Gulf War began, such a vivid and dramatic drama has been staged in front of people all over the world. The Iraqis were extremely angry about the powerful attack from the air. Saddam played with the people's feelings. He said this was proof of the cowardice of the multinational forces. They were afraid of engaging in a ground war with the Iraqi army, avoid real contact in war, so they dare not land on Iraqi soil from the air. A news media reported that American bombs flattened the air raid shelters of the Pur in Baghdad. Hundreds of old and young civilians were killed at one time. American anti-war protesters took to the streets again to protest the inhumane massacre of civilians. The U.S. military explained that they thought it was a military facility. This aroused greater indignation among pacifists. As a result, the U.S. military strictly restricted news reports by war correspondents. It stipulates that reports on the war situation must be written by the war correspondents under the protection of soldiers. Without permission, TV stations are not allowed to broadcast bloody footage of coalition soldiers in fear, pain, and injuries. Prevent the American public from knowing too much about the cruel consequences of the war, to avoid politically destructive effects. From the 17th to the 23rd, the multinational forces dropped more than 60,000 tons of bombs, equivalent to the strike force of several small nuclear warheads. The U.S. military is very satisfied with the week-long airstrikes. The success rate of airstrikes has reached 80%. The command and control system, air bases, air defense systems and missile bases of the Iraqi army have been severely damaged. After the Gulf War entered its second week, Operation Desert Storm also entered its second phase. The multinational forces shifted their bombing focus to battlefield targets. While attacking the Iraqi army's command system, Scud missile launch sites, military airports and docks, intensified the bombing of the Republican Guard's logistics supply lines. The focus of the bombing moved to southern Iraq and Kuwait. Concentrated attacks on Basra, Iraq's second-largest city, cut off the connection between the Iraqi army in this area and the interior, creating conditions for the next ground war. At this stage, Iraq's combat aircraft rarely took off to intercept. His old Mi-GS and French Mirage series were indeed unable to compete with the new U.S. military aircraft. Even 90 fighters flew directly to the airport of Iraq's sole enemy Iran for refuge, all detained by the Iranian authorities. Since then, the multinational forces aircraft have entered the airspace over Iraq and Kuwait. As if they were in an empty space, the advanced fighter jets of the U.S. military dropped bombs without hesitation. Within 7 days, the multinational forces dispatched 30,000 sorties in total. On January 303,000 sorties were dispatched in one day. According to relevant data, more than half of the multinational forces attacked specific targets on the battlefield of the Iraqi army, including the capital Baghdad, the southern city of Basra, and Kuwait City occupied by the Iraqi army. The road from Baghdad to Basra was completely cut off by repeated bombings. The Iraqi army's early warning system was also completely destroyed. 38 airports and Republican Guard bunkers were attacked repeatedly. 50 Iraqi fighter jets destroyed. 44 Iraqi ships were sunk or severely damaged. The coalition lost 25 fighter planes. It is reported that after the air battle over the Gulf became one-sided, the pilots went on missions like going to work, fly over and drop bombs and then come back to drink coffee and sleep. There is no feeling of war at all. But people all over the world are watching on TV how laser-guided bombs hit the target one by one. In order to maintain the continuity of the offensive, the multinational forces use a large number of aerial refueling aircraft. Aerial refueling may be the most meticulous job in the world. During the intense airstrike, there were even several combat aircraft waiting in line for refueling, just like the gas station on the ground refueling the cars waiting in line. If the technology is skilled, one aerial refueling only takes 5 minutes. The United States uses synthetic aperture radar to detect objects several meters underground. It can depict the distribution of Iraq's underground fortifications, so no target escapes the U.S. air at the hand of the army. In addition to bombs dropped from airplanes, the air strikes against Iraq also included a weapon that had never been used in actual combat before. The research on this weapon has a history of 46 years. In the early morning of January 17, when the first Baghdad sentry saw an object that looked neither like an airplane nor a missile flying by, he actually saw the beginning of the war. Then an American reporter heard an explosion in a hotel in Baghdad. But he could not hear the roar of bombers that usually accompany explosions. The U.S. military said that what the reporter heard was the beginning of a new era of war. That is, the first use of the most modern attack weapon of the U.S. military in actual combat. This is the U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile. When the missile was launched first, it accelerates to high altitude and then dives down to low altitude. Flies accurately to the target hundreds of kilometers away. What makes him special is that he has an extremely advanced computer to store terrain data and uses terrain navigation to search for targets autonomously. After launching, he can install the planned path to move around and avoid enemy radar and fire interception. After searching for the predetermined target, he automatically accelerates to attack with extremely high accuracy. Within 14 hours of the outbreak of the Gulf War, the U.S. military launched more than 120 cruise missiles. They're not flying fast and they fly over Baghdad like an eagle. They cannot intercept because they cannot judge his tortuous route. No one knows where he will explode, because there is no way to decipher the target graphics stored in his computer in advance. As a result, they hit the target 100 of the time. In addition to cruise missiles, the U.S. military is particularly proud of stealth bombers. The black tail wing of the F-117A stealth bomber is dovetail-shaped. A special shape makes the F-117A not a radar reflector. Therefore, it is most suitable for ground attacks on dark and windy nights. He can use lasers to lock infrared radiation targets, and then drop laser-guided bombs. It is reported that he used a bathtub filled with hot water in a residential area as an infrared radiation target during training. As a result, the bombing deviation was less than 1 meter. Cruise missiles, stealth bombers, optical electronic guided bombs, laser-guided bombs, and ordinary bombs complement each other. In Operation Desert Storm, it showed its might with its comprehensive strength. On January 26, the U.S. Air Force announced that Iraq's Air Force, which ranked 6th in the World Air Force rankings, had collapsed. At this time, the U.S. Air Force was worried that the Iraqi Air Force would also use the remaining aircraft to organize suicide attacks like the Japanese Air Force in the late World War I. On January 30, the Joint Forces Command announced that the multinational forces had achieved absolute air superiority and that the multinational Air Force could conduct patrol flights over Baghdad. At this point, the United States intended to seriously solve the problem of Scud missiles. Iraq was helpless against the multinational airstrikes, so he set his sights on Israel, desperately trying to drag Israel into the war. The Israeli capital Tel Aviv and the western port city of Haifa were attacked by Scud missiles in succession. The only thing that was not used in this war was chemical weapons, besides nuclear bombs. Everyone knows that Iraq has chemical weapons, but no one knows whether the angry Iraqis will use poison gas bombs as warheads for Scud missiles. Since January 18, Iraq has launched dozens of missiles at Israel. The Israeli government requires every citizen to wear a gas mask and enter an isolation room sealed with a seal. In Tel Aviv, buildings were blown up and the streets were filled with broken bricks. At this time, Israeli Prime Minister Shamir said, "Our restraint today does not mean that we will be restrained tomorrow." The Americans knew that the way out for the Israelis was not to intercept Scud missiles with Patriot missiles but to launch a ground attack. And the multinational forces were not ready for a full-scale ground attack at this time. When Israelis spent sleepless nights wearing gas masks, the U.S. Marine Corps has formulated a plan for a two-stage landing on the Kuwait beach. Detour to the rear of the Iraqi army to cut off its supply lines, force the Iraqi army to fight on two fronts. But the Iraqi army soon realized the intention of the multinational force, so a preemptive iceberg action plan was formulated. On January 26, Iraq launched 5 Scud missiles at Israel in succession. The U.S. Patriot missile force is doing its best to intercept. As the U.S. focuses on missile intercepts from Israel, Iraq's iceberg plan is launched. On January 27, Saddam came to the Iraqi port city of Basra. He issued an order to launch a ground attack on the Saudi border town of Khafji. Khafji is a coastal town with only more than 30,000 people and an oil storage base. It only takes about 10 minutes to drive to the Kuwait border. On the night of January 29, the Iraqi army sent about 4,000 people across the Saudi border with the support of tanks. Advancing deep into Saudi Arabia, its advanced troops entered Khafji. After an all-night fierce battle, they controlled most of the town. Saddam's basic tactic against the multinational forces was to avoid their edge, preserve strength and wait for an opportunity to counterattack. The Khafji raid was a manifestation of this basic tactic. Fiercely attacked the junction of the coalition forces. On the morning of January 30, the coalition forces and the Iraqi army encountered each other frequently near Khafji. The U.S. Marines that arrived later surrounded the Iraqi army in Khafji town. At noon, another Iraqi army that entered the Saudi border attempted to relieve the siege of Khafji, but was blocked by the Cobra helicopter of the U.S. Marine Corps. The armed helicopters, with the cooperation of the U.S. Air Force 10 attack aircraft, prevented the reinforcement of the Iraqi army. That afternoon, the U.S. Marines rushed into the town of Khafji. The two sides engaged in fierce street fighting. It was not until the morning of January 31 that the U.S. and Saudi forces recaptured the town with the help of air support. This small town full of rubble. The Battle of Khafji, which lasted less than 2 days, was the first large-scale ground engagement in the Gulf War. The coalition announced that 42 coalition soldiers were missing or injured in this battle. 466 Iraqi soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Although the coalition's losses were small, the coordination problems exposed were not small. In the Battle of Khafji, the Saudi army fought with its friendly Qatari army several times. A total of 11 American soldiers were killed, and 7 of them were killed by their own missiles. Anyway, the Battle of Khafji took place at the end of Operation Desert Storm. He brought the war that had been going on in the air to the ground. February 10, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, Schwarzkopf, announced that the multinational forces assembled in the Gulf have reached 700,000, including 500,000 U.S. troops. They are about to engage in a ground war. The world's largest oil field in the Middle East has finally been hit. Since the start of the war, Iraqi artillery has bombarded Saudi refineries from the Kuwaiti border, then bombarded the oil fields on the northeastern border of Saudi Arabia. The hit oil tanks and oil wells were set on fire. The desert erupted with a fire that never went out, staining the blue sky with filth. Then the thick smoke covered the sun and turned the day into night. The flames were blazing everywhere. The heat wave was blowing in the face. The fire made a hissing sound. Strange hell. It really feels like the end of the world. As the world's largest crude oil exporter, Saudi Arabia's oil industry started in the northeast of the country. Since the first oil well was drilled by Mobil Oil in the Dammam area on the northeast coast of Saudi Arabia in 1938, the oil development in the northeast of Saudi Arabia has lasted for more than half a century. And now the oil-producing areas within the range artillery fire have become a sea of fire with thick smoke rolling. But the more serious incidents caused by Iraq are still to come. It is the beginning of the mother of battles that Saddam mentioned before. He preached that he would go through fire and water with the Middle East, oil and humanity, and head for the Sea of Death. January 23, the U.S. military sank an Iraqi oil tanker. 2 days later, a 50-kilometer long and 20-kilometer wide black area appeared along the coast of Kuwait. There was tens of meters of crude oil floating on it. Iraq said that this was caused by the U.S. sinking the Iraqi oil tanker. But the obvious fact is that the leakage of an oil tanker could not cause such a large area of oil pollution. According to the intelligence of the multinational forces, the oil was released by the Iraqi army from the Ahmadi oil pumping station in Kuwait. On January, 287 million barrels of crude oil flowed into the Persian Gulf. The rolling black oil tide ruthlessly washed the coast. The U.S. military dispatched bombers to bomb two oil export pipeline hubs along the coast of Kuwait with laser-guided bombs. The purpose is to seal oil wells and prevent oil from continuing to flow into the Gulf. The U.S. military believes that the main purpose of the Iraqi army pouring oil into the Gulf is to prevent or delay the landing of multinational forces on the coast of Kuwait. The U.S. Navy said that the Iraqis could ignite the oil layer covering the sea surface if necessary, create an oil fire barrier to prevent landing ships from approaching the Kuwaiti coast. The oil film will block the water inlet pipe of the landing ship and damage the ship's power system. Saudi Arabia is a country with an extreme shortage of fresh water, and drinking water relies heavily on seawater desalination. The largest of these is the seawater desalination plant in Jubail, Saudi Arabia. 1/3 of the drinking water in this area is provided by this plant. The huge oil film created by Iraq is slowly drifting towards the Saudi coast. Oil will produce hydrocarbons when it comes into contact with seawater. A large amount of it entering drinking water can cause death. It will also produce a black spherical sticky substance that can directly hinder the operation of the desalination plant's machinery. Once the desalination plant is closed, it will cause serious difficulties for Saudi Arabia's drinking water. The multinational forces stationed in the area will also suffer the same fate. After the incident, U.S. President Bush issued a statement saying that this practice was disgusting, is a manifestation of despair. The Pentagon calls this environmental terrorism. International environmental experts believe that this ecological disaster in the Persian Gulf region cannot be eliminated for decades. The Iraqi government said that the truth was that American planes bombed two large oil depots in Iraq, causing a large amount of crude oil to leak into the sea. While Iraq was waging an ecological war, it also started a terrorist war. Saddam publicly called on Muslims and Arabs around the world to attack the interests of the United States and the West around the world, launch a comprehensive retaliation and push the war to the world. 2 days before the outbreak of the war, terrorist activities kicked off outside the Gulf. January 15, 8 terrorists drove a car towards the U.S. Embassy in Panama and threw 2 grenades into the embassy. On January 16, the U.S. Embassy in Ecuador was also attacked in a similar way. On January 17, when the multinational forces launched a fierce airstrike on Iraq, terrorist activities against the West are also rapidly increasing. 6 explosions occurred in the 24 hours after the outbreak of the war, including the bombing of the American Airlines ticket building in New Delhi. On January 19 and 20, the British Bank in the western district of Beirut was shot several times by terrorists. On January 20, a rocket bomb hit the Italian embassy in Lebanon. An explosion occurred in the Philippine embassy. The building was damaged and the wires were cut. On the same day, an explosion also occurred in the Thomas Jefferson Cultural Center in the Philippines. On January 21, an ATO's logistics supply office in Istanbul was blown up again. After that, explosions occurred in the British Bank in Amman, the French embassy in Lebanon, the American company in Istanbul, and the American embassy in Galgaudet. By February 5, the terrorists targeting the United States, there have been about 100 incidents. But the coalition's Desert Storm never stops. The coalition dispatches thousands of aircraft every day to carry out continuous and fierce bombing. This method has worked. In fact, the Iraqi army had lost the initiative before the US and Iraqi armies even fought on the ground. The strength of the second-line combat troops has been greatly reduced, the logistics supply has been partially interrupted, the communication has been nearly paralyzed, and the fortifications have been severely damaged. Destruction. The U.S. military judged that the overall combat capability of the opponent had been reduced by about 40. The loss rate of coalition aircraft and airstrikes was extremely low. In the Gulf War, which lasted for a month, only 29 aircraft were lost when more than 70,000 sorties were dispatched. Among them, the U.S. military accounted for 20 and about 10 pilots were captured. The Iraqi government brought more than 10 captured prisoners of war to the TV station and let them appear on the TV screen. Among them were Navy pilot Sean and Marine Hunter, British pilots Nicholas and Peters, etc. The Iraqi side not only let them show up but also let them answer questions. Sean said on TV, "I think this war should be stopped. I don't agree to go to war with Iraq. I want to tell my father, mother and sister that I am fine and ask them to pray for peace." Pilot Peter's voice was very low and his face was very painful. Iraq's actions caused a strong response in the United States and other Western countries. Western military experts believe that from the TV, some of these prisoners had obvious scars on their faces, and some looked very painful, which was obviously due to the abuse by the Iraqi side. This is a serious violation of the Geneva Convention. The British and American Foreign Ministries also met with the Iraqi ambassadors to their respective countries, sternly warned Iraq to abide by international conventions and treat prisoners of war well. However, just after the British and American warnings, the Baghdad radio station announced that these prisoners of war were detained in important scientific and economic targets in Iraq to prevent airstrikes by multinational forces. This move further angered the West. At the same time, the bodies of 11 Marines killed in the Battle of Kha FJI were transported back to the United States. Although the United States held a grand funeral ceremony for them, But the shadow of the Gulf War began to loom over the hearts of every frontline soldier and every military family. Bush gave a speech. "I know all of you are eager to know when the ground war will start. Now let me tell you, it will only start when it is necessary. The natural environment of the Gulf War is the desert." By this time, the U.S. ground forces had been in the endless yellows, and for half a year. The excitement at the time of the expedition had long disappeared and was replaced by lingering homesickness. The desert is not a good place for anyone to survive. What's more, those American youths who came from green towns and grew up in the Hollywood cultural atmosphere. The daytime temperature in the desert area of the Gulf is as high as 40 degrees Celsius throughout the year. The hot climate and frequent storms at least once a week, coupled with harassment from snakes and scorpions, have a relatively serious impact on the psychological and physical fitness of the U.S. military, the use of equipment and logistic support. The desert garrisons are generally physically and mentally exhausted, anxiety and boredom. It is said that 6 of U.S. military officers and soldiers suffer from mental depression and despair. Those with sound mind are also miserable. They only think about one thing all day long: attack as soon as possible and go home. The main issue for the U.S. government at this time is not whether it is sure to win, but whether it can win at a lower cost. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff emphasized that weapons, equipment and personnel should be fully adapted to the desert environment. Narrow the gap in adapting to the environment with the Iraqi army. The attack can only be launched when the Army, Navy and Air Force can be more effectively organized. Since February 10, although intelligence shows that the coalition forces in the Gulf region are roughly equal to the Iraqi army in number and the Iraqi army's combat effectiveness has been greatly weakened, the coalition forces can already destroy the Iraqi army with their equipment advantages. But the U.S. military is still not in a hurry to launch a ground offensive. It is necessary to further integrate the various forces and further consume the Iraqi army. There are 28 countries participating in the anti-Iraqi coalition led by the United States. The army has more than 700,000 people, more than 3,000 aircraft, more than 4,000 tanks, 247 ships. Such a large and complex force coordination is simply unimaginable without a sound command structure. In order to solve the problem of unified command, the U.S. military used the C3I command system for the first time in a large-scale airstrike. This command system is composed of reconnaissance satellites, communication satellites, early warning aircraft, battlefield surveillance command aircraft, battlefield command and control aircraft, ground radar matrix. It is composed of a computer array, display control equipment, anti-interference communication lines and a database. It integrates intelligence processing, communication, and control throughout the entire process of Operation Desert Storm. It makes the firepower under unified command multiply. Therefore, this command system is also called a war force multiplier. As of February 16, the Gulf War had lasted for more than a month. The coalition forces dispatched an average of 2,500 aircraft per day in the third and fourth weeks of bombing. According to U.S. estimates, in the 30-day airstrikes and sporadic ground attacks, 1,300 Iraqi tanks, 800 armored vehicles and 100 artillery pieces were destroyed, accounting for 1/3 of the Iraqi army's firepower deployed in Kuwait. As of February 8, another 57 Iraqi planes flew to Iran for refuge. The total number of Iraqi planes that have fled to Iran for refuge since the start of the war has reached 147. While the coalition forces were carrying out airstrikes, the ground exchanges with the Iraqi army became more and more frequent. This became the prelude to a large-scale ground war. Some of these exchanges of fire were temporary encounters between the two sides, while others were initiated by the coalition forces. On February 20, the coalition forces launched their first attack into Kuwait. U.S. helicopters attacked more than a dozen Iraqi army bunkers. The helicopter troops that arrived immediately took away more than 400 captured Iraqi prisoners. The U.S. military has always believed that Iraqi soldiers are brave and good at fighting, and would rather die than surrender. But the large number of Iraqi prisoners captured in the Battle of Kha-FJI surprised the Americans and changed their views. In the subsequent small-scale ground battles, the Iraqi army had companies surrendering en masse. The Americans realized that the morale of this army had collapsed. As the ground war approached, the stubborn Iraqi people began to panic. A freshwater panic had occurred in Iraq, followed by a food panic. Although the Tigris and the Rades rivers run through the entire country, Iraq's agriculture is not developed. Except for the unique dates, other agricultural products are mediocre and dates cannot replace food. When the whole world blocked food from him, the residents' food rations were in crisis. Most areas had to implement a food rationing system. The coalition bombs caused heavy casualties to the Iraqis, making them panic, living in the long alarm all day and night. Although the U.S. military has repeatedly claimed that the purpose of using precision-guided bombs is only to strike military targets and minimize the harm to residents near military targets. Even so, precision-guided bombs only account for 8 of the total number of head bombs. A large number of ordinary bombs without eyes still caused thousands of civilian casualties. Saddam's high-pressure rule over Iraq. But even so, all kinds of rumors and hearsay are still spreading throughout Iraq. At this time, the Kurds in northeastern Iraq began to take to the streets to ask Saddam to stop and save the precarious country. Operation Desert Storm is a direct battle between the Air Force and the Army. The Air Force's mission was originally to bomb and seize air control, but the Iraqi Air Force hid and fled, completely giving up the right to control the air. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi army troops had no air cover and became the direct target of the coalition aviation. In previous wars, infantrymen ultimately completed the fighting. But in some battlefields of the Gulf War, the coalition Air Force resolved the battles. The army only cleaned up the battlefield and buried the bodies of Iraqi soldiers. Although the coalition ground war has not yet begun, the overall situation of this war has been determined. If the multinational forces launched a ground war, the Iraqi army would collapse in an instant. It should be said that Saddam also clearly saw the outcome of this war at this time. He decided to withdraw from the war. On February 12, he suddenly met with Primakov, the special envoy of the Soviet president. When Saddam held hostages, the Soviet Union condemned Iraq's aggression. Saddam showed leniency and allowed only 5,000 Soviets stranded in Iraq to return home. During the Gulf War, the Soviet Union and Iraq always maintained contact. Now Saddam hopes that the Soviet Union can help him through the difficulties. On the night of February 211,992, Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz flew to Moscow. After meeting with Soviet President Gorbachev for 2 hours, after that, the Soviet and Iraqi sides quickly reached an 8-point agreement on Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait. The agreement was broadcast to the world just after midnight. Iraq was so anxious because it realized that the ground offensive was imminent and wanted to use the withdrawal to avoid the war. But people are sensitive. Iraqis intuitively realized that it would be difficult for the coalition forces to forgive the actions of the Republican Guard. They began to flee in large numbers. Main contents of the Soviet-Iraqi agreement. 1. Iraq's complete and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. 2. The withdrawal will start from the day after the ceasefire. 3. Complete the withdrawal of troops within the prescribed time limit. For when the withdrawal is completed by 2-3, the international community will stop sanctions against Iraq. 5. After the withdrawal, all decisions of the United Nations on Iraq will become invalid. 6. After the ceasefire, both sides will immediately release prisoners of war. 7. The United Nations will entrust non-belligerent countries to supervise the withdrawal. 8. The two sides will continue to discuss the details of the withdrawal title. The Iraqi refugees march slowly on the mountain road. It seems that they have lost hope for peace. In fact, the 8-point agreement has a sharp decline from the position of the mother of battles to the position of withdrawing troops immediately as long as there is a ceasefire, which should be said to be of substantive significance. This step was taken at a critical moment when the Gulf War was facing escalation. Iraq hopes that the Soviet background of this agreement, the international community will not ignore the mediation of major powers, especially for a superpower with the same world status as the United States. Although the Soviet Union was already in trouble both internally and externally and was on the eve of disintegration. But after all, it still had a complete and huge military machine. The only thing in the world that the U.S. armed forces dare not underestimate is this machine. The reason why the Soviet Union was willing to help Saddam before the coalition launched a ground war. It was also because he had a complicated mood about the Gulf War. The Gulf War broke out because the balance between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Middle East was finally broken in the 1990s. The Soviet Union's economic problems, both internally and externally, made it unable to compete with the United States for the Middle East. That's why the United States was so bold to fight a war in the eyes of the whole world. But it used the scientific and technological means of the 21st century to fight a colonial war that was almost like the one in the early 20th century. It was also because of this that the Soviet Union seemed so calm for the first time in decades on the issue of the Gulf War. It believed that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait could not be punished by invading Iraq. If in the past the world would have found the rationality of this understanding. But now the United States has suddenly launched it as its storm. In the storm, Soviet warships also sailed into the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. But being an observer alone could not influence the war situation at all. What embarrassed the Soviet government even more was that the war took place hundreds of kilometers outside the southern border of the Soviet Union. The U.S. military traveled more than 15,000 kilometers to fight outside the southern border of the Soviet Union and might set up camp there after the war. This alone was a comprehensive provocation to the Soviet Union's own security. When people all over the world were paying attention to the Gulf War in various ways with various feelings, the Soviet Union finally took extraordinary action and chose the last opportunity when the war was about to come to mediate the withdrawal of Iraqi troops. This poses a question for the United States: should the United States continue to fight? The Soviet-Iraqi agreement caused a strong response from the world after it was announced. Radical Arab countries welcomed it. Moderate Arab countries rejected it. Western countries reacted cautiously. After the Soviet-Iraqi 8-point agreement was announced, Bush immediately summoned senior staff to the White House to study countermeasures. They felt the shrewdness of this agreement. If it is accepted, it means that the advantages accumulated during the Desert Storm will be gone and the ground war that has been painstakingly prepared will be ruined. Even if Iraq withdraws from Kuwait, it will only return the looted property to its original owner. Saddam not only did not lose any territory, but also was able to keep his army relatively intact after causing a world-class disaster. At the same time, the United States lost face. Because the coalition forces fought for so long, but the one that Iraq finally succumbed to was the Soviet Union, which did nothing. But it was difficult not to accept the Soviet-Iraqi 8-point agreement. The purpose of the United States sending troops to the Gulf was to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. Iraq is going to withdraw from Kuwait now, so we can't stop him from withdrawing. A few hours after the Soviet-Iraqi 8-point agreement was announced, President Bush had come up with a countermeasure. He walked out of the conference room and announced the specific conditions for the U.S. government to ask Iraq to withdraw its troops on the White House lawn. If any of them cannot be met, the United States will go to war. So it was actually an ultimatum. These conditions include: 1. The Iraqi army will begin withdrawing from Kuwait at 1200 GMT on February 23, and will withdraw all troops within a week. 2. The legitimate government of Kuwait must return within 48 hours. 3. The Iraqi army must return to its position before August 1 last year within a week. 4. All prisoners of war and third country nationals must be released within 48 hours. And the bodies of killed and deceased military personnel must be returned. 5. Withdraw all defense forces from Bubidan Island, Warby Island in the Rome, Malay Lail Field in Kuwait, on the Iraq-Kuwait border. 6. All explosives deployed in Kuwait oil fields must be removed, and information on all minefields on the ground and at sea must be provided to the coalition forces. 7. Anti-aircraft artillery fire and all flight activities over Iraqi Kuwait must be stopped. 8. Stop all destructive activities against Kuwaiti citizens and property, and release all detained Kuwaitis. If Iraq publicly announces its acceptance of these conditions before 1200 noon on February 23, New York time, the United States and its allies will not launch a ground offensive. On the surface, Bush's conditions are not harsh. It does not contain any insulting clauses and still leaves Iraq with a glimmer of hope. But the killer is that the stipulated withdrawal and other schedules are difficult to implement. So analysts believe that Bush does not want Gorbachev to reap the spoils. In fact, the United States and the Soviet Union are tacitly aware of this. That is, Iraq will definitely not accept the U.S. ultimatum. This is the basis for launching a destructive offensive that paved the way for a large-scale ground war aimed at destroying a military force or even overthrowing Saddam's regime. The Iraqi Revolutionary Command Council immediately issued a statement saying that Iraq would not pay any attention to the U.S. ultimatum. The White House presidential spokesman in Washington also issued a brief statement expressing regret for Iraq's rejection of the last chance for peace and claiming that the ground war could start at any time. This is the last way out for Saddam. In fact, although the withdrawal time proposed by the United States is very strict, if Iraq wants to implement it, it can invite observers and reporters from various countries to enter the war zone to supervise Iraq's withdrawal. Even if the withdrawal cannot be completed on time, the whole world can see that Iraq is indeed withdrawing its troops, but it is not completed due to insufficient time. A few more days will be enough. After seeing Iraq's withdrawal, the public opinion in the United States may not support American boys going to the battlefield, and the ground war may be avoided. Does Iraq have any choice now? How to choose between life and death? However, stupid Saddam once again chose a dead end. At 12 noon on February 23, the coalition forces were ready to go in the desert. President Bush's order was conveyed to all officers and soldiers. The deadline has passed. Iraq has not agreed to the conditions proposed by the coalition, and now I order the use of all existing forces, including ground forces, to drive the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. On February 1991, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Powell and Secretary of Defense Cheney hurriedly arrived in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. Then, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Gulf Forces, Schwarzkopf, rushed back to Riyadh from the frontline troops. In this way, 3 of the 4 main leaders of the United States who planned the Gulf War, except President Bush, have gathered in the Saudi capital. This is something that has attracted international attention and naturally aroused high vigilance on the part of Iraq. He was speculated by the outside world as a major signal that the coalition forces were about to launch a ground offensive. In fact, the U.S. plan to switch from air strikes to ground offensives had not yet been finalized. At the time, President Bush approved during Operation Desert Storm. It was only a principle to launch a ground offensive 1 month after the bombing. But after February, time was very tight because there were various Muslim festivals in March. If the war was delayed until then, it would cause religious resentment. The purpose of Powell and Cheney's trip was to finalize the ground offensive plan from Schwarzkopf and his generals. At the same time, the Saudi king Fahd and other Gulf countries were informed of the U.S.'s determination to launch a ground offensive and obtain the approval of these countries. Cheney and Powell convened a series of military meetings at the U.S. headquarters in Riyadh. Finally confirmed various details. Cheney came to before returning home. He made a special trip to the frontline troops to take a look and stood on a tank to mobilize the troops. Cheney had just received a detailed battle plan at this time. Its code name was Desert Sabre. The Desert Sabre operation plan proposed several options for launching the attack. Bush finally chose February 24 at 100 GMT. So far, the entire battle plan and implementation date had been determined. At this time, the U.S. military not only kept the date of the attack strictly confidential, even any reports involving ground attacks were restricted. The only thing that could be broadcast before the war was the peaceful footage of Schwarzkopf mobilizing the troops before the battle. The U.S. will show the public an incredibly limited and pure war. The U.S. military even completely removed the video recorders installed on the bombers to display the offensive situation, because he would record the pilots' nervous curses and the fear during the battle. From these pre-war shots, the audience could not even tell that these American soldiers would start a life-and-death battle in the desert in a few days, the largest in the 20th century with 1.2 million troops fighting for their lives in the same desert. The Pentagon secretly calculated how many people would die in the ground war. They estimated the number to be around 1,000. Based on the combat, the coalition originally planned to attack Kuwait in 3 routes. The central route was to break into Kuwait from the front. The western route was to bypass Kuwait from the west. The eastern route was to launch an ending operation from the sea. In the original plan, the central route was the main assault direction. The western route was to encircle and cut off the connection between Kuwait and Baghdad. The eastern route's sea attack was to support. The main U.S. 70th Army was deployed in Qasuma, Saudi Arabia, south of Kuwait, and was planned to be the main assault group in the central route. But Saddam had fully estimated the main assault direction of the U.S. military. In the 5 months after the invasion of Kuwait, an inverted triangle defense system was established, focusing on the defense of southern Kuwait. If the U.S. military attacks southern Kuwait, it will be a head-on confrontation. The war is coming. Schwarzkopf immediately made a decisive decision to deal with the fact that Iraq did not deploy heavy troops on the western Saudi-Iraqi border. On February 22, he suddenly moved the main force 200 kilometers westward, changed to a major assault on the west side of the Iraqi defense line. Such a change in deployment on the battlefield would not have time to adjust the deployment even if Iraq noticed it. Kuwait City, the capital of Kuwait, is close to the sea, and the U.S. military has carried out amphibious landing operations many times in history. Saddam always thought that the U.S. military would come from the sea. In fact, the U.S. military did not regard landing operations as the focus. But since ancient times, deception is not uncommon in war. The coalition warships have been feigning along the coast of Kuwait. A fleet carrying the Marine Corps cruised in the northern Persian Gulf all day long. The mine-sweeping troops entered the Kuwait Bay in early February to sweep mines, creating the illusion of a large-scale landing. Iraq really fell into the trap and urgently sent reinforcements from the western position to the Kuwait coast. In this way, Iraq's deployment of troops in the real direction of the U.S. military's attack was weakened. After the main direction of the coalition's attack moved westward, the 70th Army remained stationed at its original location. Saddam was convinced that the U.S. military would launch the main attack in the south, thus ignoring the western defense line. At 100 a.m. Greenwich time on February 241,991, the coalition forces had begun Operation Desert Saber, which kicked off the Gulf Ground War. Surface-to-surface missiles and powerful and intensive ground artillery deprived the Iraqi army of its remaining combat capabilities and remaining fighting will. The troops of 13 countries, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, Britain, France, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, Syria, Egypt, Kuwait, Canada and Italy were involved in Operation Desert Saber. A total of 530,000 troops were involved in the attack. The attack was carried out in 4 routes. 3 of them attacked Kuwait from land, and 1 of them carried out an amphibious landing in eastern Kuwait. At the same time, President Bush made a radio speech from the White House, announcing that the ground offensive aimed at driving the Iraqi army out of Kuwait had begun. He told the American public that I have ordered General Schwarzkopf to use all available forces, including ground forces, together with the coalition forces to drive the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. This decision was made again after extensive consultations among our coalition partners. The liberation of Kuwait has now entered its final stage. I have every confidence that the coalition forces are capable of completing their mission quickly and decisively. Tonight in this, when a coalition of nations does what is right and just, I just ask you all to stop what you are doing and pray for all the allied forces. Pray especially for our men and women in uniform. They are risking their lives for our country and all of us at this very moment. May God bless and protect each and every one of them. May God bless the United States of America. While Americans pray for the soldiers on the Gulf front, the once treated to end Marine divisions of the United States have broken through the first line of Iraqi defense. It was only 2 hours before the general offensive was launched. By the time the sun came out in the morning, the tanks of the 2nd Marine Division had already penetrated 55 kilometers into Kuwait, breaking the Iraqi army's second line of defense. A 17,000-man U.S. amphibious landing force is tying down Iraqi forces in the sea east of Kuwait. More than 2,000 paratroopers dropped by the 101st Street Airborne Division into Iraq also penetrated more than 80 kilometers into the Iraqi front line a few hours later. At the same time, the coalition air force dispatched more than 1,200 sorties to open up paths and provide fire support for the ground attack forces. At this time, the French and British attack columns directly entered Iraq from Saudi Arabia and broke through 50 kilometers in 3 hours. A Kuwaiti brigade advanced to 40 kilometers from Kuwait City 8 hours after the battle started. At this time, the Iraqi army had been divided and surrounded by the coalition forces. Not only can they not communicate with each other, but they have also lost contact with the capital Baghdad. At dawn on the 24th, about 300 helicopters of the 101st Street Airborne Division of the U.S. Army were ordered to take off from 13 locations in northern Saudi Arabia. According to the Associated Press reporter who interviewed the 101st Street Airborne Division, the sand and dust raised by these planes when they took off dyed the sky yellow. By the evening of the same day, these helicopters had transported 2,000 soldiers, 50 transport vehicles, a large number of howitzers, and other ammunition and a large amount of gasoline to the war zone. These soldiers immediately opened up an area of 155 square kilometers to establish a forward supply base. The code name of this base is Cobra. Saddam established a Saddam line. It consists of sand embankments, barbed wire, minefields, and anti-tank trenches. In some places, the minefields are as deep as 2 kilometers. Saddam placed high hopes on this line of defense. He said that the struggle for Kuwait will ultimately depend on the battle between soldiers with rifles and bayonets and soldiers of the Zon-HA-Ally, and we are more experienced in this kind of battle. This may be somewhat true. It's just that the American soldiers who are not good at fighting with knives don't intend to fight with the Iraqi army with bayonets. The U.S. minesweeping troops used rockets to carry a long string of explosive packs connected by wires into the sky, falling in a long arc. The explosive packs on the wire exploded at the same time after landing, thus detonating all the mines on this path, opening a passage for tanks to move in the minefield. The 70th Army, which was responsible for the main assault mission, rushed north at full speed with almost no resistance. On February 26, the third day after launching the ground offensive, this armored assault group of more than 100,000 people advanced about 200 kilometers to the north and arrived at the Euphrates River Valley. After the coalition forces completed the deep penetration and encirclement of the Iraqi Republican Guard, the 18th Airborne Army of the United States was responsible for cutting off the Iraqi army's retreat. In this way, the elite Republican Guard of the Iraqi army was surrounded, and the encirclement extended to the Euphrates River in the north, the border between Iraq and Kuwait in the south, and the Persian Gulf in the east. The 1st Street Armored Division of the 70th U.S. Army, which was responsible for the main attack, squeezed from the west to the east. The U.S. Marine Corps advanced from the Saudi-Kuwait border from the south to the north. In the face of a very unfavorable ground battle, Saddam ordered the Iraqi army to withdraw from Kuwait on the night of February 25. After receiving the order to withdraw, the Iraqi army retreated northward along the coastal highway. The Iraqi army retreating from Kuwait City and other areas was crowded on the highway from Kuwait to Iraq. The coalition's attack aircraft and helicopters attacked fiercely in the sky. The ground was pressed from the south. The Arab coalition forces coming over were caught in a pincer attack by the Marines and the U.S. and British armored forces that attacked quickly from the west. The Iraqi army is finished. According to eyewitnesses, thousands of armored vehicles, transport vehicles and tanks were destroyed there. The coalition forces encountered only small-scale resistance. In some cases, the Iraqi army surrendered as a whole battalion. From the 24th to the 25th, the Allied forces had captured 21,000 prisoners of war, destroyed more than 270 tanks and seized 20 T-62 tanks and 40 armored vehicles. In just one day, the 3 lines of defense of 500,000 Iraqi troops collapsed. According to the U.S. military, a frontline commander said that the most troublesome problem for them at this time was not how to cross the minefield, but how to transport thousands of Iraqi prisoners of war to the rear. The Allied forces' Western Assault Group's offensive was the most successful. The Western Route attack force included 1 armored division each from the British Army and the French Army, part of the U.S. 70th Army, the U.S. 1st Street Cavalry Division, part of the 101st Street Airborne Division, and the Arab Army. They urgently transferred the assault troops 200 kilometers westward before launching a ground offensive. The purpose of the transfer was to break through the weak defense section of the Iraqi army in one fell swoop, forming a large deterrent encirclement with the frontal attack forces. On the morning of the 24th, the attacking troops occupied the important city of Nasiriyah between Basra and Baghdad with almost no resistance. This city controls the key point of Highway 6 on the Euphrates River. This completely divided the 3 major Iraqi armies in the Baghdad, Basra and Kuwait directions. Because the U.S. military had set up the Cobra forward supply base in this direction in advance. When these 2 steps were revealed with murderous intent at the same time, the edge of the Desert Saber also flashed brightly. The Iraqi army has realized that there is nothing to fight in the next battle. If they fight again, they will be divided and then eaten in pieces. Their remaining fighting spirit also collapsed and they abandoned their positions and surrendered in droves. The frontline commanders of the U.S. military also encountered an old problem: how to transport these tens of thousands of Iraqi prisoners of war, since only 4 U.S. soldiers were killed and 21 were injured in the 2-day battle. So the logistics support system, that was fully prepared to rescue the wounded before the war, was now serving large numbers of Iraqi wounded on the verge of death. When the morning of February 26 came, the coalition forces still maintained their momentum of victory. The Iraqi army, which had been passively beaten since the coalition launched Operation Desert Storm, wanted to avoid being surrounded and annihilated. At the end of the war, there was a sudden struggle. The coalition encountered strong resistance from the Iraqi army on this day. So much so that after the war, military experts called February 26 the decisive stage of the Gulf War. In the early morning of this day, the British 1st Street Armored Division fought with the Iraqi army and defeated the enemy after a long battle. The 1st Street Division of the U.S. Marine Corps also launched an attack on the Iraqi army that retreated to Kuwait Airport in the early morning. The 2 sides faced off with tanks and fought for a day until dark. The most intense battle took place in the middle of the road. The 70th U.S. Army fought with a division of the Iraqi Republican Guard during the advance and failed to defeat them after a long battle. The U.S. military had to use air support directly from aircraft carriers to attack the Iraqi army. The 1st Street Infantry Division of the 3rd Armored Division of the U.S. Army also engaged in a fierce battle with a division of the Republican Guard. The U.S. Army used hundreds of the most advanced Mi-1 tanks to attack in turns before finally defeating the opponent. At this time, the coalition forces attacking Iraq had advanced to the Euphrates River, cutting off the retreat route of about 100,000 Republican Guards to the north. The 70th Army of the U.S. Army and the 1st Street Armored Division of the British Army had surrounded the Basra defenders. At the evening press conference, Lieutenant General Kelly, the U.S. Chief of Operations, said that the Iraqi forces had been surrounded. In the early morning of the 26th, 135 Baghdad radio interrupted its normal broadcasting program and announced that the Iraqi government had UN Security Council Resolution 660. It has ordered the Iraqi army to withdraw in an organized manner to the positions before August 1 last year. Saddam said that the Iraqi army will complete the task of withdrawing from Kuwait within 24 hours, and Kuwait will no longer be a part of Iraq. He said that Iraq has achieved a spiritual victory, but it is difficult to face the attack of more than 30 countries. Bush said that Saddam's announcement of withdrawal at this time is not only too late but also absurd, and the Allied forces will continue to intensify the war operations. On the morning of the 26th, the coalition forces completed the siege of Kuwait City. Except for the sea in the east, Kuwait City some exits were blocked. But the U.S. Marines did not enter the city immediately. They were stationed outside the city waiting for the Kuwaiti, Saudi, Egyptian and Syrian troops to enter the city first. It is said that in addition to political reasons, it is also because the U.S. military does not speak Arabic. Although the Kuwaiti resistance has taken control of the city, but there are still small groups of Iraqi troops in the city who have not had time to retreat. And the U.S. military is also worried that the Iraqi army will leave mines and traps in the city. A U.S. soldier bluntly said that in order to reduce casualties, we are going to let the Kuwaitis go in first because they are most familiar with the situation in the city. The Kuwaiti Seekers Brigade and other Arab troops arrived in the suburbs of Kuwait City in the evening of February 26. At 6:27 am on the 27th, the Kuwaiti army held a ceremony to enter the city. Thousands of Kuwaiti citizens lined the streets filled with rubble and garbage to welcome the troops entering the city. At 9:11, the Kuwaiti army raised the Kuwaiti flag in the International Peace Square in the city center. The nearly 7-month occupation of Kuwait by Iraq was officially ended. While the Kuwaiti army launched an attack to clear out the remaining enemy forces in the city, the 1st Street Marine Division of the United States also launched a final attack on the Kuwait airport, 15 kilometers away from the city, before dawn and quickly occupied the airport. After 2 days of fierce fighting, this division destroyed 100 Iraqi tanks in the airport and surrounding areas, and completely wiped out the Iraqi Army's 3rd Armored Division. At the same time, another U.S. military unit entered the city from the south to search for the remaining Iraqi troops and control the southern and western urban areas near the airport and port. The Arab army that had entered the city from the north controlled most of the remaining areas, including the city center and commercial district. The small number of Iraqi troops that did not have time to evacuate and remained in the city did not put up any organized resistance. Remaining Iraqi soldiers surrendered to Kuwaiti resistance members and coalition forces. At this time, most Iraqi troops had evacuated Kuwait. Saddam tried to stabilize the front in southern Iraq at a considerable cost. In order to avoid greater destruction, Iraq called for a ceasefire and sent a letter to the UN Security Council expressing its willingness to unconditionally accept all 12 resolutions passed since Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. So far, the ground fighting in the Kuwait theater has basically come to an end. It took the coalition less than 3 days from the launch of the offensive to the recovery of Kuwait. During this period, the coalition destroyed 285 Iraqi tanks, 962 armored vehicles and 5 artillery pieces, accounting for 50, 33 and 48 of the total Iraqi equipment respectively. According to this number, the Iraqi army has obviously suffered heavy losses. But the war is not over. 80 kilometers west of Basra, the U.S. 70th the Army and the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division surrounded the 3 most elite divisions of the Republican Guard and Armored Division, equipped with Soviet-made T-72 tanks, totaling about 60,000 people. The last scene of the Gulf War was the most exciting and thrilling battle. 1 encirclement and 1 breakout. One is the trump card of the US military and the other is the trump card of the Iraqi army. It's a life and death struggle. 800 US-made M1 tanks fought against 300 Soviet-made T-72 tanks in a tank battle. Both tanks are the most advanced weapons of the US and the Soviet Union. The Iraqi army dispatched its air force, which it had not dared to use since the beginning of the war. The US military also launched a large number of fighter jets to participate in the battle. The sky was in chaos and the ground was full of smoke. A large number of US helicopters also directly supported the ground combat. As a result, the Republican Guard tanks were almost completely wiped out in the fierce battle. The U.S. military then occupied the Narisaya airport on the Euphrates River. The remaining Iraqi troops were divided into Baghdad, Basra and Kuwait, and were no longer able to fight. The 4-day ground battle came to an end. The coalition forces paid a very small price with only 145 casualties, including 79 American soldiers, 51 Saudi soldiers and 15 British soldiers. In addition, the US and British troops were injured to 113 and 31 respectively. 45 fighter planes were lost. This is quite different from the figure released by the Iraqi army that 180 coalition fighter jets were shot down. Winning a huge war with such small losses is indeed a miracle, as the US military commander Schwarzkopf said. A US military spokesman said that the Gulf War defeated more than 40 Iraqi divisions, causing 85,000 to 100,000 casualties. There were 175,000 Iraqi prisoners of war alone, and destroyed or captured 3,500 Iraqi tanks, destroyed 18 armored vehicles and 2,000 artillery pieces, also destroyed 97 fighters and helicopters, and all Iraqi ships. It is said that Iraq still has 20 to 25 divisions and about 200 aircraft, but no navy. Just as the Iraqi Republican Guard retreated northward, General Schwarzkopf, the commander-in-chief of Operation Desert Storm, asked President Bush for permission to command the army to cross the Euphrates River and completely destroy the Republican Guard. President Bush did not adopt this suggestion and ordered the U.S. and allied forces to suspend military operations at 800 a.m. local time on February 28. After the coalition forces fully controlled Kuwait and occupied 2.6 square kilometers of southern Iraq, they stopped the attack at around 850 and entered the defensive position. At this time, the Iraqi army had been defeated, and most of the Iraqi army's trump card Republican Guard had been annihilated. Saddam knew that he could not save his country. Defeat. 3 hours after Bush announced the ceasefire, Saddam was also forced to announce a ceasefire and unconditionally accept the 12 resolutions of the UN Security Council. The 100-hour ground battle ended at this point. The Iraqi government expressed its unconditional acceptance of all 12 resolutions made by the UN Security Council since the Gulf crisis. They are Resolution 660 condemning the invasion of Iraq, Resolution 661 imposing economic sanctions on Iraq, Resolution 660 to declaring the annexation of Iraq invalid, Resolution 660 for demanding the release of hostages from Iraq, Resolution 665 approving unverifying Iraqi ships, Resolution 666 stipulating the principles of providing food to Iraq, Resolution 667 condemning Iraq's violation of the embassy, Resolution 616 providing assistance to countries that have suffered losses due to sanctions against Iraq, Resolution 670 imposes an air blockade on Iraq and Kuwait, Resolution 670 reaffirms Iraq's release of hostages, Resolution 667 condemns Iraq's destruction of archives, Resolution 678 sets a final deadline for withdrawal. At this time, Kuwait City is full of ruins. Nearly 700 of the 940 oil wells are buried. It will take at least a year to extinguish the fire. It will cost at least $50 billion. And this war was fought because Saddam asked Kuwait for $10 billion but was rejected, and Saddam got nothing. The Gulf War, which lasted 42 days, is probably the war with the most disparity in casualties between the two sides in human history. The outbreak of the war, at the time of the outbreak, the number of troops assembled on the front lines of both sides was about the same, both about 700,000 or 800,000. According to the statistics released by the coalition after the war, the Iraqi army suffered nearly 100,000 casualties and more than 170,000 prisoners. The coalition's casualties, prisoners and missing persons added up to only a few hundred people. On March 21,991, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 600 requiring Iraq to take further measures to end hostilities. Iraq accepted this resolution and sent four representatives to the Saudi capital Riyadh on March 21 to discuss the exchange of prisoners with coalition representatives. Both sides agreed to speed up the repatriation of prisoners. But Iraq had almost no prisoners to repatriate except for the capture of 4,000 Kuwaiti civilians. On the contrary, his scattered troops continued to surrender and fill the Allied POW camps. The Gulf War is the largest modern war since World War I. There are 39 participating countries, of which the United States has deployed a total of 527,000 troops from the Army, Navy and Air Force, 1,300 aircraft, 1,700 helicopters, more than 2,000 tanks, more than 2,200 armored vehicles, and more than 100 ships. The Gulf War is a century-end war. It is a local war that can only be fought by mobilizing half of the industrial world on the earth. It is impossible to fight a cheap war in today's fiercely competitive industrial economy. Before the war, Bush had promised the Gulf countries that the U.S. military would return home immediately after the Gulf War. 28 days after the official ceasefire of the Gulf War, 160,000 U.S. troops withdrew from the Gulf. But there are still 380,000 people stationed there. From then on, the United States finally set foot in the Middle East in a reasonable way. In this war, Operation Desert Shield cost a total of $12.9 billion. In Operation Desert Storm, 45 days of air warfare cost $13.3 billion. 4 days of ground warfare cost $1 billion. Prisoners of war post-treatment cost $7 billion. U.S. troops returned to the country and redeployed and spent $5.2 billion. The total cost of the Gulf War reached $50 billion. Whenever we look back on the Gulf War, we always sigh at the glorious victory of the U.S. military. But after sorting out all the historical materials, I feel that what I gained most is the failure of Iraq. Iraq is like the best negative teaching material to remind the world how a country stepped into the abyss. The country fell into economic difficulties for various reasons. After that, all the citizens of this country did not think about how to work together to overcome the crisis, but thought about how to rob. I have read countless history books. Basically, after falling into an economic crisis, 90 of the countries thought about robbing. The citizens of these countries did not think about how to work hard and how to develop productivity. Instead, they complained that someone stole my things and someone took my job. We went to eliminate them and we could resolve the crisis. This kind of thinking is not only happening in Iraq, but Iraq is the one with the worst outcome. There is not only one Saddam in the world, but Saddam is the most shameless and stupid one among these ambitious people. This war took place on the eve of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The U.S. military demonstrated its military power beyond the world. Its high-tech weapons far surpassed the times. It can be said that the U.S. military in 1991 can still crush all countries except China, including Russia, even in 2024. 1991 was the year when the United States led the world the most. This war also awakened the real opponents of the United States. Hope for world peace. Finally, here is the list of troops sent by all participating countries in the coalition. The United Kingdom deployed hundreds of tanks, 85 combat aircraft, 22 ships, and 42,000 people. Egypt deployed more than 350 tanks and more than 40,000 people. France deployed 60 combat aircraft, 18 ships, 350 tanks, and 20,000 people. The Gulf Cooperation Council deployed a squadron of Mirage F-1A fighters, 19 combat aircraft, and 10,000 people. Italy deployed 10 Tornado fighters, 3 frigates, and 4 minesweepers. Kuwait deployed 35 combat aircraft, 7,000 people participated in the war, and provided $16 billion in funding to the United States. Pakistan sent 11,000 infantry troops to participate in the war. Spain assisted to air bases using a total of 2 frigates and a destroyer. Syria deployed about 300 tanks and 14,300 people participated in the war. Turkey provided the use of the NJILIK base for 100 fighters, 3 destroyers and a minesweeper. Afghanistan participated in the war with 300 people. Argentina deployed 2 combat ships, 2 combat aircraft, and 450 people participated in the war. Australia deployed a destroyer, a frigate, a supply ship, and a minesweeper defense force 20 to 30 people. Bulgaria aided an army engineering unit. Belgium aided 6 C-130 aircraft and 2 minesweepers. Denmark aided a small frigate. Greece aided a frigate. Honduras participated in the war with 150 people. Morocco participated in the war with 2,000 people. Niger 480 people. Senegal 500 people. The Netherlands provided 2 frigates, a supply ship, and a 40-person medical team. New Zealand provided 3 transport planes, a 100-person support team, and a medical team. Norway provided 1 military supply ship. Sierra Leone Arshitsim Ember medical team. Czechoslovakia 200-member chemical defense unit, 150 medical personnel. Japan provides hundreds of off-road vehicles and $13 billion in funding to the coalition. Hungary provides a 40-member medical team. Poland provides a 17-member medical team and a medical ship. Portugal provides a logistics supply ship. Singapore provides a 30-member medical team for use in British military hospitals. South Korea provides a C-130 transport aircraft, a 154-member medical team, and $400 million in funding to the coalition. Sri Lanka provides airports and waters to refuel ships and aircraft. Sweden provides an army field hospital with 350 beds.